They didn't build Mauthausen to hide death. They built it to display it. High above the Danube River, on a hill carved from granite, stood a camp where survival was never the goal. This was not a place of confusion or chaos. It was precise, calculated, methodical, a system where human beings were destroyed slowly, deliberately, and in full view of the world. This was Mauthausen-gusen, the camp where the Nazis perfected death through labor. Here, prisoners were not selected for gas chambers on arrival. Instead, they were sentenced to exhaustion, to starvation, to stone and stare and whip. Day after day, men were forced to carry massive granite blocks up 186 uneven steps, a staircase that became known as the Stairs of Death. Those who fell were beaten. Those who couldn't stand were crushed beneath the bodies behind them. And those who survived the climb were sent back down to do it again. This documentary tells the complete history of Mauthausen-gusen, from its creation in 1938, through its expansion into one of the deadliest camp systems in Nazi Europe, to its final days of collapse, death marches, and liberation by American forces in 1945. But this is not only a history of cruelty. It is a warning. This is Mauthausen-gusen, death through labor. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Origins of Mauthausen, a camp born from ideology. Long before the first prisoner collapsed on the stone steps, before the quarries filled with bodies and the barracks overflowed with the starving, Mauthausen existed as an idea rooted not in chaos, but in order, not in rage, but in calculation. To understand how Mauthausen-gusen became one of the deadliest camp systems in Nazi Europe, we must begin in the years before the war, when National Socialism was still presenting itself as discipline, renewal, and strength, and when terror was being carefully designed behind desks and drafting tables. In March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. Almost overnight, Austria was absorbed into the Reich, its institutions dismantled, its laws rewritten, and its enemies identified. Social democrats, communists, trade unionists, intellectuals, priests, Jews, Roma, and anyone suspected of disloyalty were suddenly exposed. Arrests came quickly, filling makeshift prisons and local jails beyond capacity. The SS needed a permanent solution not only to detain these people, but to break them, exploit them, and remove them from society entirely. That solution would rise on a granite hill near the small town of Mauthausen, overlooking the Danube River. The location was not chosen at random. Nearby lay some of the richest granite quarries in the region, once used to supply stone for Vienna's grand buildings. To the SS, this stone represented more than raw material. It symbolized permanence, dominance, and empire. Adolf Hitler and his architects envisioned a rebuilt German world of colossal monuments and eternal Reich structures. Granite would be required in vast quantities, and human labor would be cheaper than machines. Prisoners would provide both punishment and profit. In August 1938, the SS officially established Konzentrationslager Mauthausen. From the beginning, it was placed under the control of the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, signaling its role as both a terror site and a business enterprise. Unlike early camps such as Dachau, which initially focused on political repression, Mauthausen was conceived as a camp of annihilation through labor. It was designated a Category 3 camp, the harshest classification in the Nazi camp system. This category was reserved for those deemed incorrigible enemies of the Reich, people the regime believed could not be reformed and therefore did not deserve to survive. Survival was never the goal. Exhaustion, degradation, and death were. The first prisoners arrived in the late summer of 1938, many of them Austrian political detainees transferred from Dachau. They were forced to build the camp themselves, dragging stones, erecting fences, and constructing barracks under constant beatings. From the outset, Mauthausen operated under a philosophy of total domination. Guards were instructed not merely to control prisoners, but to crush them psychologically. Arbitrary punishments, collective reprisals, starvation rations, and endless roll calls were not accidents of cruelty. They were tools of governance. The camp commandant and SS leadership believed that constant uncertainty and fear would destroy solidarity and resistance. Very quickly, the granite quarry became the heart of the camp. Prisoners were marched down steep paths into the pit each morning and driven back up at night carrying blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who fell were often shot or pushed down the steps. The infamous stairway of death, with its 186 uneven stone steps, emerged not as a single execution site, but as a daily mechanism of attrition. The SS guards understood that they did not need gas chambers to kill. Gravity, hunger, cold, and exhaustion would do the work for them. By 1939, as Germany prepared for war, Mauthausen's role expanded. New categories of prisoners arrived: Poles, Czechs, Spanish Republicans who had fled Franco's victory, and later Jews from across occupied Europe. Each group was assigned markings, stripped of identity, and ranked within a rigid prisoner hierarchy that encouraged division and competition for survival. Capos, prisoner functionaries, were selected, often from violent criminal categories, and given authority over others, turning prisoners into instruments of their own oppression. This system was deliberate. The SS understood that terror worked best when victims were forced to police one another. As the camp grew, satellite camps began to emerge, especially at nearby Gusen. What started as an extension of Mauthausen soon became something even more lethal. Gusen I, established in 1940, would eventually surpass Mauthausen itself in death rates. Prisoners there were worked longer hours, fed even less, and subjected to brutal underground labor projects that drained the last strength from their bodies. Together, Mauthausen and Gusen formed a single organism, a death engine fueled by ideology, bureaucracy, and economic demand. Importantly, none of this was hidden. Local civilians saw the camp rise. They heard the gunshots, watched the columns of skeletal men pass through nearby roads, and benefited from SS contracts and forced labor industries. Mauthausen did not exist in isolation from society. It existed within it. This is what made it so dangerous. It demonstrated how mass suffering could be normalized, legalized, and embedded into everyday life. By the time World War II erupted in September 1939, Mauthausen was no longer an experiment. It was a functioning model of how the Nazi state intended to rule through terror. The camp had proven that human beings could be reduced to expendable units of labor, that death could be gradual and systematic, and that an entire administrative machine could operate without questioning its purpose. What began as a quarry on a hill had become a warning to the world, though few yet understood what it meant. In the chapters that follow, this system will expand, harden, and consume hundreds of thousands of lives. But here, at the beginning, Mauthausen stands as proof that genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with classification, with ideology, and with the quiet decision that some people are no longer meant to live. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Death Through Labor. How Mauthausen was designed to kill without gas. From the moment prisoners passed through the gates of Mauthausen, the camp made one truth unmistakably clear. Survival was never part of the plan. Unlike extermination camps built later with gas chambers designed for rapid mass murder, Mauthausen perfected a slower, more insidious method of killing, one that relied on exhaustion, starvation, brutality, and despair. This method had a name within the Nazi system: Vernichtung durch Arbeit, annihilation through labor. It was not a metaphor. It was policy. Every aspect of daily life inside Mauthausen was engineered to drain the human body until it failed. Food rations were deliberately insufficient, calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract maximum labor before collapse. A typical daily ration consisted of thin, watery soup, a small piece of bread, and occasionally a trace of margarine or sausage. The calories provided were far below what was required for survival, especially for men forced to perform backbreaking physical labor for 12 to 14 hours a day. Hunger became a permanent condition, a constant, gnawing presence that shaped every thought, every movement, every moral choice. Prisoners scavenged for potato peels, chewed grass, and risked beatings or death for scraps of food. The quarry was the epicenter of this system. Each morning, thousands of prisoners were marched down into the granite pit under SS supervision, often at a run. The work itself was punishing beyond endurance. Breaking stone with primitive tools, hauling massive blocks, loading carts, and carrying slabs up steep inclines. The infamous stairway of death turned this labor into a ritual of destruction. Prisoners were forced to carry stones up its uneven steps while guards stood above them, watching. If one man fell, he often dragged others down with him. Guards sometimes laughed, sometimes beat the fallen, and sometimes pushed prisoners deliberately to create avalanches of bodies. Deaths were not recorded as murders, but as work accidents. This bureaucratic language was essential to the system. By reducing human destruction to administrative terminology, the SS stripped killing of moral consequence. Illness was treated as weakness, not a condition requiring care. Prisoners suffering from dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, or infected wounds were still expected to work. Those who could not stand during roll call were beaten. Those who collapsed during labor were kicked awake or shot. The camp infirmary, known as the Revier, was not a place of healing. For many, it was the final stop before death. Lacking medicine, sanitation, or adequate staff, the Revier became a holding area for the dying. SS doctors conducted selections there, marking prisoners deemed unfit for work. These men were often sent to Hartheim Castle, a former euthanasia center adapted to murder camp prisoners by gas. Thus, even those who survived labor too long were removed. Violence in Mauthausen was not random. It was structured. Guards were encouraged to assert absolute dominance through cruelty. Beatings were routine and arbitrary. Prisoners could be punished for incorrect posture, slow movement, or failing to salute properly. Punishments included standing for hours in freezing temperatures, being suspended by the arms behind the back, a torture that dislocated shoulders, or confinement in dark cells without food. Public executions were staged to reinforce fear. Hangings were conducted in front of assembled prisoners, forcing them to watch as a warning of what awaited those who resisted. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Prisoners were stripped of names and assigned numbers. Personal belongings were confiscated. Heads were shaved. Families were separated. Language barriers were exploited to isolate groups. The SS fostered internal divisions by ranking prisoners according to Nazi racial and political categories. Criminal prisoners were often placed in supervisory roles over political detainees, creating resentment and violence among inmates. This system fractured solidarity and forced prisoners into impossible moral dilemmas, where survival sometimes meant participating in the suffering of others. Time itself became a weapon. Endless roll calls lasted for hours in heat, rain, or snow. Prisoners stood motionless while guards counted, recounted, and punished entire blocks for discrepancies caused by death during the night. Corpses were dragged into formation to be counted among the living. Sleep deprivation weakened resistance. Days blurred into one another, erasing any sense of future. Hope became dangerous because disappointment could kill faster than hunger. As the camp expanded, the SS refined these methods further. Mauthausen was not a chaotic hellscape. It was a controlled environment where death was managed, anticipated, and documented. Productivity reports tracked output from the quarry. Mortality rates were accepted as operational costs. Replacement prisoners arrived regularly, ensuring a constant supply of labor. In this way, Mauthausen functioned as both a prison and a factory, one that consumed human lives as raw material. By the early years of the war, this system had already killed tens of thousands. And yet, it continued to grow, proving to the Nazi leadership that extermination did not require secrecy or immediate violence. It could be achieved openly, methodically, and legally under the guise of discipline and work. In Mauthausen, death wore the uniform of routine. It arrived each morning with the roll call, echoed through the quarry, and settled into the barracks at night. This was not chaos. It was design. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Prisoners of Mauthausen. Who was sent here, and why few survived? Mauthausen was never intended to hold ordinary prisoners. From the very beginning, it was designated as a camp for those the Nazi regime considered the most dangerous, the most expendable, and the least deserving of survival. Within the SS classification system, Mauthausen was labeled a Category 3 camp, a place reserved for prisoners deemed incorrigible enemies of the Reich. This single bureaucratic label carried lethal consequences. It meant harsher discipline, heavier labor, fewer rations, and almost no expectation of release. Those sent to Mauthausen were not meant to be re-educated or broken and returned to society. They were meant to disappear. The first large groups transported to the camp were Austrian political prisoners after the Anschluss of 1938, Social Democrats, communists, trade unionists, intellectuals, and critics of the Nazi state. Many were educated men with no experience in manual labor, suddenly forced into quarry work designed to destroy bodies accustomed to desks and books. Their rapid physical collapse reinforced the SS belief that such prisoners were weak and disposable. Soon after, German political prisoners followed, along with so-called professional criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexual men, and others marked as socially undesirable. Each group was identified by a colored triangle sewn onto striped uniforms, a system that reduced human identity to symbols and categories. Jewish prisoners began arriving in increasing numbers after 1939, and especially after the outbreak of war. Unlike later extermination camps where Jews were murdered immediately, Mauthausen subjected Jewish prisoners to prolonged destruction. They were deliberately assigned the most dangerous and exhausting labor, particularly in the quarry. SS guards and capos often targeted Jewish prisoners for extra abuse, beatings, and humiliation. Anti-Semitism was not merely ideological here. It was operational. Jewish prisoners were expected to die faster, and the system was adjusted accordingly. Soviet prisoners of war arrived in massive numbers after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Many were executed outright upon arrival, especially officers and political commissars. Others were worked to death under conditions even harsher than those imposed on other prisoners. Starved, beaten, and denied basic shelter, Soviet POWs died by the thousands within weeks. Their deaths were so frequent that burial details could not keep pace. Corpses lay exposed near the barracks, further eroding any remaining sense of humanity within the camp. As the war expanded, Mauthausen became a hub within a growing network of subcamps collectively known as Mauthausen-gusen. These subcamps were scattered across Austria and southern Germany, often located near armaments factories, mines, and construction projects vital to the Nazi war economy. Prisoners were transferred between camps without notice, severing fragile social bonds and preventing any stable form of resistance. Each transfer increased the likelihood of death. Many prisoners did not survive the transport itself. Inside the camp, survival depended on an unstable hierarchy enforced by the SS. Prisoners were forced into roles as capos, block elders, and labor supervisors. Some used their positions to protect others where possible, but many enforced SS orders brutally, knowing that failure meant punishment or death. This system turned prisoners against one another, fracturing solidarity and making collective resistance nearly impossible. Moral choices became unbearable. Sharing food might save another person but doom oneself. Helping a fallen comrade could invite a beating or execution. The camp forced prisoners into constant calculation between compassion and survival. Language barriers deepened isolation. Mauthausen held prisoners from across Europe: Poles, Spaniards, French, Italians, Yugoslavs, Hungarians, Czechs, Greeks, Soviets, and more. Communication was fragmented. Misunderstandings could be fatal. Orders shouted in German were not always understood, and failure to comply instantly often resulted in violence. The SS exploited this confusion deliberately, turning language into another weapon. Children and adolescents were not spared. Although Mauthausen was primarily a camp for adult men, boys as young as 14 were imprisoned, particularly from occupied Eastern Europe. Their smaller bodies were even less capable of enduring the labor and starvation imposed upon them. Many died quickly. Those who survived did so by chance, hidden kindness, or assignment to slightly less lethal work, factors entirely beyond their control. Medical experiments added another layer of suffering. Prisoners were subjected to injections, infections, and surgical procedures without anesthesia, often under the guise of treatment. These experiments served SS research interests and provided another method of selection and killing. Refusal was impossible. The body itself became property of the camp. Over time, death became normalized. New arrivals were shocked by the sight of emaciated figures, corpses stacked near barracks, and the constant presence of smoke from crematoria. Long-term prisoners learned not to react outwardly. Grief became dangerous. Mourning wasted energy. Survival demanded emotional numbness. And yet, even within this system, traces of humanity endured. Whispered conversations, shared memories, quiet acts of assistance that defied the logic of annihilation. By the early 1940s, Mauthausen had already earned its reputation as one of the deadliest camps in the Nazi system. Prisoners across occupied Europe feared its name. To be sent to Mauthausen was widely understood as a death sentence, not because of gas chambers, but because the camp itself functioned as a killing machine. It consumed bodies slowly, relentlessly, and without spectacle. The prisoners of Mauthausen were not anonymous casualties of war. They were individuals systematically selected, categorized, exploited, and destroyed, not by accident but by design. This was the human inventory of a camp built to prove that death could be engineered through work, discipline, and time. Chapter 2, Segment 1. The Granite Quarry, where work became a weapon. From the moment prisoners arrived at Mauthausen, the granite quarry defined their fate. It was not simply a place of labor. It was the core mechanism through which the camp killed. The SS did not hide this reality. The quarry lay in full view beneath the camp, an open wound carved into the hillside, its steep stone walls descending like a pit with no bottom. Prisoners understood immediately that this was not ordinary forced labor. It was a calculated system designed to exhaust, injure, and eliminate. The SS referred to Mauthausen as a camp of extermination through work, and nowhere was this philosophy more brutally applied than in the quarry known as Wiener Graben. Granite was valuable to the Nazi regime. It was used for monumental architecture, state buildings, and symbols of imperial power. But economic utility was only part of the story. The quarry allowed the SS to combine ideological punishment with physical annihilation. Prisoners were marched down into the pit at dawn and forced to extract massive stone blocks using primitive tools. Pickaxes, hammers, and bare hands struck unyielding rock for hours at a time. Dust filled the air, coating lungs already weakened by starvation. Injuries were constant. Fingers were crushed, backs shattered, feet torn open by sharp stone. There was no medical care in any meaningful sense. A broken body was not treated. It was replaced. The most infamous feature of the quarry was the stairs of death. 186 uneven stone steps carved into the rock face leading back up to the camp. Prisoners were forced to carry granite blocks weighing up to 50 kilograms on their backs while climbing these steps. The stairs were narrow, irregular, and slick with mud, ice, and blood. Falls were inevitable. When one prisoner collapsed, those behind often fell with him, creating deadly chain reactions. SS guards sometimes encouraged this chaos, laughing as bodies tumbled down the stairs, crushing others below. In some cases, guards deliberately pushed prisoners from the top, sending them crashing to their deaths. These killings were euphemistically recorded as accidents. The quarry was also a site of outright murder. SS guards and capos used it as a place to execute prisoners deemed too weak to work, too slow, or simply undesirable. Prisoners were beaten to death with rifle butts, clubs, or stones. Others were shot under the pretense of escape attempts. A particularly cruel method involved forcing prisoners to stand at the edge of the quarry wall, known among inmates as the parachutist's wall. Guards would shove them over, watching their bodies break against the rocks below. The quarry thus became both a workplace and an execution ground, blurring any distinction between labor and killing. Work schedules were relentless. Prisoners labored from early morning until dusk, regardless of weather. In winter, icy winds swept through the quarry, freezing sweat-soaked clothing to skin. In summer, heat radiated off the stone, turning the pit into an oven. Rations did not increase to match the physical demands. Daily food consisted of thin soup, a piece of bread, and sometimes a scrap of margarine or sausage substitute. Caloric intake was vastly insufficient. Starvation was not a side effect. It was a tool. The SS calculated rations carefully to keep prisoners alive just long enough to extract maximum labor before death. The quarry imposed psychological destruction as well. Prisoners were forced to witness the deaths of others constantly. There was no escape from the awareness that one misstep, one moment of weakness, could mean falling down the stairs or being selected for death. This constant terror eroded morale and fostered despair. Hope itself became dangerous. New arrivals often tried to push themselves harder, believing effort might earn survival. Veterans of the quarry knew better. They understood that no amount of compliance would save them. The system was not designed to reward endurance. It was designed to break it. Prisoners were often assigned to quarry labor as punishment. A minor infraction, a perceived attitude problem, or arbitrary SS displeasure could result in transfer to the stone detail, widely understood as a death sentence. Capos used this threat to enforce obedience. The quarry became synonymous with annihilation. Even prisoners assigned to other work details lived in fear of being sent there. The sound of boots approaching at night, the calling of names during roll call, could signal a transfer that meant almost certain death. The quarry also served a symbolic function. It demonstrated SS power visibly and constantly. From the camp above, guards could look down and watch prisoners struggle like ants beneath them. This vertical hierarchy mirrored the ideological hierarchy of Nazism itself. The SS above, prisoners below, reduced to expendable material. The physical geography of Mauthausen reinforced its moral structure. By forcing prisoners to carry stone upward while their bodies were being ground down, the camp enacted a grotesque parody of progress and civilization. Granite extracted through human destruction would later be used to glorify the Reich, embedding suffering directly into its architecture. Over time, the quarry devoured tens of thousands of lives. Many prisoners did not survive their first weeks. Others lingered for months, deteriorating slowly. Muscles wasted away, wounds festered, infections spread. Eventually, most were no longer able to work. When that moment came, they were selected for execution, transfer to the gas chamber installed later in the camp, or abandonment to die in the barracks. The quarry did not simply kill bodies. It destroyed any illusion that survival depended on merit, strength, or morality. It taught prisoners that death was not an accident or failure, it was the goal. Mauthausen's quarry stands as one of the clearest examples of how the Nazi system transformed labor into a method of murder, turning work itself into a weapon wielded with precision, cruelty, and intent. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Hierarchy, Terror, and the Science of Breaking Human Beings. If the quarry was the physical engine of death at Mauthausen-gusen, the internal camp hierarchy was the psychological machine that ensured it never stopped. Survival in Mauthausen was not determined only by strength or endurance. It was shaped by a carefully engineered system of domination that turned prisoners against one another, rewarded cruelty, and dissolved solidarity. The SS did not govern the camp alone. They ruled through layers of controlled brutality, delegating power to selected prisoners and creating a world where violence became routine, normalized, and often invisible to those at the top. This system ensured that terror permeated every corner of daily life, even when no SS guard was present. At the base of this structure were the ordinary prisoners, men reduced to numbers, stripped of identity, and classified by colored triangles sewn onto their uniforms. Political prisoners, marked with red triangles, initially formed a large portion of Mauthausen's population. Criminal prisoners, marked with green triangles, were often elevated into positions of authority as capos because the SS believed they were more willing to use violence. Jewish prisoners, marked with yellow triangles or stars, were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy, subjected to the harshest labor, the least food, and the greatest abuse. Soviet prisoners of war were treated as disposable enemies, often murdered outright or worked to death within weeks. Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexual men, and others deemed undesirable were similarly marginalized. This classification system was not administrative convenience, it was deliberate fragmentation. By dividing prisoners into categories with unequal chances of survival, the SS prevented unity and fostered resentment, fear, and competition. Above the mass of prisoners stood the capos, inmates appointed by the SS to oversee work details, barracks, and discipline. In theory, capos were responsible for maintaining order and productivity. In reality, they were instruments of terror. Many capos abused their power ruthlessly, beating prisoners, withholding food, assigning lethal work details, or killing outright. Some did so out of cruelty, others out of fear. The SS made it clear that capos were replaceable. A capo who failed to maintain discipline could be demoted and sent to the quarry, where death was almost certain. Power in Mauthausen was therefore always conditional, always unstable. To survive, capos often became more brutal than the guards themselves. Violence flowed downward, minimizing the need for direct SS involvement while maximizing suffering. Daily life inside the barracks was governed by this constant threat. Roll calls could last for hours, regardless of weather. Prisoners stood motionless in freezing rain or snow, collapsing from exhaustion while guards and capos counted and recounted bodies. The dead were forced to remain standing, supported by fellow prisoners, to avoid punishment for incorrect numbers. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded rooms where sanitation was non-existent. Lice infested clothing and bedding, carrying typhus and other fatal illnesses. Medical care was a fiction. The camp infirmary was often a gateway to death, where prisoners deemed unfit for work were selected for execution, lethal injection, or transfer to the gas chamber once it became operational. Punishment was arbitrary and omnipresent. A missing button, an incorrect salute, a moment of weakness. Any of these could result in beating, confinement in standing cells so small prisoners could not sit or lie down, or assignment to the most deadly labor. Public punishments were staged deliberately to instill fear. Prisoners were forced to watch floggings, hangings, and executions. The lesson was clear. Obedience did not guarantee survival, but resistance guaranteed death. Over time, this uncertainty eroded the sense of self. Prisoners learned to anticipate violence, to shrink inward, to suppress emotion. Survival required constant vigilance and emotional numbness. Starvation intensified this breakdown. Food rations were calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to work, not long enough to recover. Hunger became an obsession that consumed thought and behavior. Men fought over crumbs, traded shoes for bread, stole from one another, and sometimes betrayed fellow prisoners in desperate attempts to survive. The SS understood this perfectly. Starvation was not merely neglect. It was strategy. A starving population is easier to control, less capable of resistance, more likely to fracture internally. In this environment, moral boundaries blurred. Acts that would once have been unthinkable became necessary choices in a world stripped of normal ethics. Yet even within this system, resistance existed, fragile, hidden, and dangerous. Some political prisoners formed secret networks to share information, protect the weak, and sabotage production when possible. Acts of resistance were often small. Slowing work, misplacing tools, sharing food, recording names of the dead. These acts carried immense risk. Discovery meant torture or execution, but they also preserved a sense of humanity in a place designed to erase it. The SS feared these networks deeply, which is why surveillance was constant. Informers were encouraged. Trust became dangerous. A whispered conversation could mean death if overheard or reported. The psychological toll of this environment cannot be overstated. Prisoners lived in a state of permanent uncertainty, unable to plan beyond the next hour. Time itself became distorted. Days blurred together, marked only by labor, roll call, and exhaustion. The future did not exist. Survival was reduced to endurance, moment by moment. Many prisoners described a sense of becoming hollow, watching themselves from a distance as their bodies weakened and their identities dissolved. This was not an accident. Mauthausen was designed not only to kill bodies, but to destroy the inner life of those trapped within it. The hierarchy and terror of Mauthausen ensured that extermination did not require constant direct killing. Most prisoners died from a combination of labor, starvation, disease, and abuse, deaths that could be recorded as natural or inevitable. This allowed the SS to maintain a veneer of order and legality, masking genocide behind bureaucracy. By the time a prisoner collapsed and was selected for death, the system had already done its work. Mauthausen thus functioned as a laboratory of domination, proving that a society could be dismantled from within, using fear, hunger, and delegated cruelty as its primary tools. In this environment, death was not always immediate. It was systematic, gradual, and relentless, a process perfected day by day, prisoner by prisoner. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Medical abuse, selection, and the final stages of death through labor. As the hierarchy and daily terror of Mauthausen-gusen ground prisoners down physically and psychologically, another layer of destruction operated quietly behind barbed wire and locked doors. The camp's medical system. In name, it existed to treat illness and maintain the workforce. In reality, it functioned as an extension of extermination, a mechanism for selection, experimentation, and disposal. The SS doctors stationed at Mauthausen were not healers. They were administrators of death, using medical language and procedures to legitimize murder while maintaining the illusion of order. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion, disease, or injury were often sent to the Revier, the camp infirmary. For many, this was the final stop. The Revier was overcrowded, understaffed, and deliberately neglected. Beds were scarce, sanitation was non-existent, and medical supplies were minimal. Treatment consisted of little more than isolation and observation, not to heal but to determine whether a prisoner was still useful. Those deemed capable of returning to work were sent back to the quarry or factories, often before recovery, sealing their fate. Those considered unfit were marked for death. Selections occurred constantly and quietly. SS doctors and guards walked through barracks, infirmaries, and work details, assessing prisoners with cold efficiency. Weight loss, visible illness, or weakness could be enough to condemn someone. Prisoners were lined up naked, examined like livestock, reduced to bodies to be categorized and discarded. Many did not understand that these inspections were death sentences until it was too late. Selected prisoners were transferred to execution sites, killed by injection, shot, or later gassed. The process was bureaucratic, routine, and devoid of spectacle, precisely how the SS preferred it. Medical experiments formed another dimension of this abuse. At Mauthausen and its subcamps, prisoners were subjected to tests designed to benefit the Nazi war effort or advance racial theories. These experiments were conducted without consent, anesthesia, or concern for survival. Prisoners were injected with toxic substances, exposed to extreme cold, deliberately infected with diseases, or subjected to surgical procedures that caused permanent injury or death. Results were recorded meticulously. Suffering was incidental. The prisoner was not a patient but a resource, consumed in the pursuit of data. Disabled prisoners, those with chronic illnesses, and those who could no longer work were considered burdens. Many were transferred to so-called euthanasia centers or killed within the camp itself. This was the continuation of the Nazi T4 program under a different guise. Language played a critical role. Death was described as special treatment, disinfection, or relocation. Paperwork masked murder, allowing perpetrators to distance themselves psychologically from their actions. Clerks filed forms. Doctors signed certificates. Guards followed orders. Each step was small, procedural, and devastating in aggregate. As the war intensified, conditions worsened dramatically. By 1943 and 1944, Mauthausen-gusen expanded rapidly as prisoners from evacuated camps in the east were transported westward. The population exploded beyond capacity. Barracks designed for hundreds held thousands. Sanitation systems collapsed. Water supplies failed. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis became endemic. Death rates soared. The medical system, already lethal by design, became overwhelmed. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be removed. Crematoria operated continuously, yet could not keep pace. Corpses lay stacked in courtyards, barracks, and infirmaries. The smell of decay permeated the camp. Prisoners assigned to corpse details described carrying dozens of bodies daily, often of men they had known only days earlier. Death lost its shock. It became background noise, a constant presence woven into daily routine. This normalization of death was one of the camp's most destructive effects. When survival requires emotional detachment, grief becomes a liability. Starvation deepened this collapse. Food rations shrank further as supplies dwindled. Soup became thinner, bread portions smaller. Prisoners scavenged for potato peels, grass, anything remotely edible. Hunger drove men beyond physical weakness into delirium. Many collapsed mid-step, unable to continue. Those who fell during work details were beaten or shot. Others were dragged away and never seen again. The boundary between living and dying narrowed until it disappeared entirely. As Allied forces advanced in early 1945, the SS began preparations to erase evidence. Records were destroyed. Prisoners were evacuated on death marches toward other camps. Those too weak to march were executed. Columns of skeletal men were driven across frozen roads, collapsing under exhaustion and exposure. Guards shot those who could not keep up. Mass graves appeared along the routes. Even in retreat, the machinery of death continued to function. Inside the camp, fear intensified. Prisoners did not know whether liberation or annihilation would come first. Rumors spread, some hopeful, others terrifying. The SS became more unpredictable, alternating between indifference and sudden violence. Medical selections increased as guards attempted to reduce the number of witnesses left behind. Yet amid this chaos, acts of quiet resistance persisted. Prisoners hid the sick during inspections. Others shared information about approaching Allied troops. These acts carried enormous risk, but they preserved fragments of solidarity in a world designed to extinguish it. When liberation finally came in May 1945, what Allied soldiers found defied comprehension. Emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, abandoned execution sites, and evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. Mauthausen-gusen stood exposed as what it had always been. Not a prison, not a labor camp, but a carefully engineered system of destruction. The medical abuse, selections, and death through labor were not excesses or accidents. They were the camp's purpose. This segment of Mauthausen's history reveals a central truth about the Holocaust. Genocide did not rely solely on gas chambers or mass shootings. It relied on systems, medical authority corrupted into execution, bureaucracy transformed into murder, and everyday procedures weaponized against human life. At Mauthausen-gusen, death wore a clinical face. It arrived with forms, inspections, and diagnoses. And by the time it reached its victims, the system had already stripped them of strength, identity, and voice, leaving behind a silence that still demands to be remembered. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Gusen, the industrial core of extermination. If Mauthausen was the symbol of terror, Gusen was its engine. Hidden beneath the same SS command structure but operating on an even more ruthless scale, the Gusen subcamp complex became the industrial heart of the Mauthausen system, a place where death through labor was no longer a consequence, but a calculated outcome. Established in late 1939 near the village of St. Georgen and der Gusen, Gusen was built with one purpose: to extract every possible unit of labor from prisoners before discarding their bodies as expendable waste. From the beginning, Gusen was different. Prisoners arriving here quickly understood that survival chances were far lower than at Mauthausen itself. The SS deliberately sent those they considered politically dangerous, racially undesirable, or physically expendable to Gusen. Polish intelligentsia, Spanish Republicans, Soviet prisoners of war, Jews, and later deportees from across occupied Europe were funneled into a camp designed to break human beings at maximum speed. Guards openly referred to Gusen as a death camp, not because of gas chambers but because the work itself was lethal. The camp's foundation was forced labor tied directly to the Nazi war economy. Prisoners were deployed into granite quarries, construction projects, and later massive underground armaments factories carved into the hillsides. These underground tunnels, codenamed Burgerstall and Kellerbau, were engineered to protect weapons production from Allied bombing. Digging them required relentless physical exertion under catastrophic conditions. No ventilation, constant dust, unstable ceilings, and shifts that stretched endlessly. Prisoners labored 12 to 14 hours a day, often longer, driven by beatings, threats, and starvation. Unlike civilian labor systems, productivity at Gusen was measured not by output alone, but by how quickly workers could be replaced. SS planners understood that prisoners would die in enormous numbers. This was factored into logistics. New transports arrived regularly to replace those who collapsed. Death was not a failure of the system. It was proof that it was working as intended. Bodies were reduced to statistics, interchangeable units within a vast industrial process. Housing conditions reflected this philosophy. Barracks were overcrowded beyond imagination. Wooden bunks stacked 3 levels high held emaciated men pressed together with no space to move. Lice infested clothing and skin. Disease spread rapidly. There was no attempt to prevent it. In fact, sickness served as another filter. Those who weakened were removed through selection and execution. Water was scarce, sanitation non-existent. Prisoners often slept in damp clothing soaked with sweat, rain, or sewage. Rest was insufficient. Exhaustion became permanent. Food rations at Gusen were even more inadequate than at Mauthausen. Prisoners received watery soup and scraps of bread that could not sustain heavy labor. Weight loss was rapid and irreversible. Men lost the ability to walk, to lift tools, to think clearly. Hunger eroded moral boundaries. Yet even in this state, acts of solidarity persisted. Shared crumbs, whispered warnings, mutual support during inspections. These gestures did not save many lives, but they preserved fragments of humanity in a system designed to erase it. Violence at Gusen was constant and normalized. Capos, often prisoners themselves elevated into positions of power, enforced SS discipline with brutality. Some were coerced, others corrupted by the authority they wielded. Beatings were routine. Executions were public enough to instill terror but frequent enough to lose shock value. Prisoners learned quickly not to react. Survival depended on emotional suppression. Grief, anger, and fear had to be buried deep, because any visible weakness invited punishment. As the war intensified, Gusen expanded rapidly. By 1943 and 1944, it became one of the largest camp complexes in the Nazi system, absorbing tens of thousands of prisoners. Subcamps multiplied. Industrial output increased even as conditions deteriorated. The contradiction was intentional. The SS believed that terror, not humane treatment, produced obedience. The camp became a place where time collapsed. Days blurred together in endless cycles of labor, hunger, and fear. Death surrounded every task. Men collapsed in tunnels, crushed by cave-ins or suffocated by dust. Others fell at roll call, too weak to stand. Those who could not work were removed, often never returning. Corpses were dragged away by fellow prisoners assigned to death details. These men carried the dead with practiced motions, detached from emotion as a means of self-preservation. In Gusen, death was not sudden. It was incremental, methodical, and relentless. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Prisoners were stripped of names, replaced with numbers. Communication was restricted. Isolation deepened despair. Many lost the will to resist, entering a state of resignation known among prisoners as Mauthausen, a condition of extreme exhaustion and apathy that usually preceded death. The SS recognized this state and used it as justification for execution. Those who no longer resisted were labeled useless. Yet even here, resistance flickered. Prisoners sabotaged machinery when possible, slowed production, shared information. These acts were small and often futile, but they carried immense risk. Discovery meant torture or death. Still, the very existence of resistance challenged the camp's objective. It proved that total domination was never complete. Gusen was not an aberration within the Nazi camp system. It was its logical evolution. It demonstrated how ideology, industry, and bureaucracy merged into a single mechanism of destruction. The camp did not need gas chambers to fulfill its role. Labor itself became the weapon. Every stone carried, every tunnel carved, every shift endured pushed prisoners closer to death while feeding the Nazi war machine. This segment reveals Gusen as the clearest embodiment of the phrase, death through labor. Not metaphorically, but literally. Survival here was not expected. It was accidental. And when the camp finally collapsed under the weight of its crimes, what remained was not just evidence of cruelty, but proof of how modern systems, factories, schedules, production quotas, can be transformed into tools of annihilation when stripped of moral restraint. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The Underground Factories and the Mechanics of Death. As the war turned against Nazi Germany, Gusen's role shifted from quarry labor to something even more sinister. Above ground, Allied bombers increasingly struck German industry. Below ground, the SS answered with one of the most brutal adaptations of the camp system. Vast underground factories carved directly into the hills by prisoners who were never meant to survive the work. These tunnels were not merely construction projects. They were an extension of extermination policy, disguised as industrial necessity. Beginning in 1943, thousands of prisoners were driven underground to build what became some of the largest subterranean weapons facilities in Europe. The most notorious of these was the Burgerstall complex, designed to produce advanced aircraft components for the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. To the SS and armaments planners, these tunnels represented technological salvation. To the prisoners, they were graves carved in advance. Work continued day and night. Shifts blurred into one another, often without clear rotation. Artificial light replaced daylight. Time lost meaning. Conditions inside the tunnels were catastrophic. Air circulation was minimal. Stone dust filled the lungs, causing irreversible damage. Prisoners coughed blood, struggled to breathe, and collapsed without warning. Cave-ins were common, crushing men beneath tons of rock. When accidents occurred, work rarely stopped. Bodies were removed only when they obstructed production. Sometimes they were left in place, sealed behind newly poured concrete. The dead literally became part of the structure. The SS enforced productivity with terror. Prisoners were beaten for slowing down, punished for mistakes caused by exhaustion, and executed for sabotage, whether intentional or imagined. Food rations were never increased to match the intensity of the labor. Starvation accelerated physical collapse. Men worked until their bodies failed, then were replaced by new transports. The system depended on constant replenishment. Human life was a consumable resource. Medical care existed only in name. Camp infirmaries functioned less as hospitals and more as sorting stations. Those deemed recoverable enough to return to work were patched up minimally. The rest were selected out, sent to be killed by injection, shot, or transferred back to Mauthausen for extermination. Disease spread unchecked. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and dysentery flourished in the damp underground environment. The SS saw sickness not as a problem, but as an efficient method of reduction. The psychological impact of underground labor was devastating. Prisoners lost any sense of connection to the outside world. There were no seasons, no sky, no horizon. Many spoke later of a crushing sense of burial while still alive. Men whispered that they were already dead, simply waiting for their bodies to realize it. Sleep deprivation intensified hallucinations. Some prisoners deliberately injured themselves in hopes of being removed from tunnel duty, even knowing it might lead to execution. The tunnels broke minds as effectively as they broke bodies. Despite this, resistance continued in small, nearly invisible ways. Prisoners misaligned components, damaged machinery subtly, and passed information through whispered networks. These acts rarely halted production, but they carried immense symbolic weight. They asserted a final measure of human agency in a system designed to eliminate it entirely. Discovery meant torture or death, yet resistance persisted, not because it promised survival, but because it preserved dignity. The SS kept meticulous records of output while remaining indifferent to casualty figures. Reports tracked tons of rock removed, meters of tunnel completed, and weapons assembled. Death rates were rarely mentioned. This bureaucratic abstraction allowed those in command to distance themselves from the suffering they orchestrated. Killing was not recorded as violence, but as labor attrition. Language transformed murder into management. As the underground factories expanded, so did Gusen's reputation even among prisoners in other camps. Transfers to Gusen were feared as death sentences. Veterans of the camp warned newcomers in hushed tones. Work hard, stay invisible, conserve strength at all costs. Many still perished within weeks. Survival depended on youth, luck, and often the help of others who were themselves barely alive. By late 1944, the system began to fracture under its own weight. Allied bombing intensified, supply lines faltered, food deliveries dwindled further. SS discipline grew erratic, alternating between rigid brutality and chaotic violence. Yet the work continued. Even as Germany faced inevitable defeat, the SS drove prisoners deeper underground, extracting labor from bodies already ruined beyond recovery. The underground factories of Gusen reveal the full logic of Nazi extermination policy when merged with industrial modernity. These were not chaotic killing grounds. They were organized, planned, and optimized. Engineers calculated airflow and load-bearing structures. Administrators scheduled shifts. Guards enforced quotas. And through it all, prisoners died in numbers that were both expected and accepted. This segment exposes how genocide did not require overt massacres to function. It could be carried out through schedules, blueprints, and production targets. The tunnels of Gusen stand as proof that the Holocaust was not only an act of hatred, but an act of administration, where efficiency replaced conscience, and industry became a tool of annihilation. Chapter 3, Segment 3: Starvation, Selection, and the Slow Erasure of Life. By the time prisoners reached Gusen, most already understood that survival was unlikely. But what made Gusen uniquely lethal was not only the brutality of labor or the underground factories. It was the systematic way starvation, selection, and administrative cruelty were used together to erase human beings slowly, deliberately, and almost invisibly. Death here was rarely sudden. It was engineered to arrive through exhaustion, hunger, disease, and despair, stretched out over weeks or months until resistance itself collapsed. Food at Gusen was never meant to sustain life. Daily rations were calculated at levels far below what the human body required, especially for men forced into 12 to 14-hour shifts of extreme physical labor. Morning often began with a thin liquid masquerading as coffee, followed by a midday soup made mostly of water, turnips, or rotten vegetables, and a small portion of bread in the evening, sometimes mixed with sawdust or ground fillers. Calories were scarce. Nutrients were almost non-existent. Hunger was constant, gnawing, and unrelenting. As weeks passed, bodies began to change in predictable ways. Weight fell rapidly. Muscles wasted away. Faces became hollow, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. Skin stretched tightly over bone. Prisoners spoke of a constant dizziness, of standing up only to black out and fall. Even minor wounds refused to heal. Infections spread quickly. The weakest collapsed during roll call, during labor, or while standing in line for food. Collapse often meant death. The SS did not view starvation as a failure of the system. It was the system, Prisoners weakened by hunger worked more slowly, made more mistakes, and became easier to control. When they could no longer work, they were no longer considered useful. At that point, another mechanism took over: selection. Selections at Gusen were frequent and terrifying. SS doctors and officers would inspect prisoners, sometimes at random, sometimes after labor shifts, sometimes during roll call. Men were ordered to strip naked regardless of weather. Bodies were examined quickly, clinically, without emotion. Those deemed too weak, too thin, too sick, or too old were marked, often with a gesture, a note, or a spoken number. Selection did not require explanation. Everyone knew what it meant. Those selected were removed from the barracks under the pretense of medical care or transfer. In reality, many were taken to be killed by lethal injection, shot, or sent back to the main Mauthausen camp to be exterminated in gas chambers or execution sites. Others were left to die untreated in overcrowded infirmary blocks, where death came slowly through disease and neglect. The process was efficient, quiet, and repeatable. It reduced the camp population without disrupting labor output. Disease flourished in these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia swept through barracks packed far beyond capacity. Prisoners slept stacked together on wooden bunks, often without blankets, in filthy clothing crawling with lice. Latrines overflowed. Clean water was scarce. Hygiene was impossible. Illness became another tool of selection, a natural filter that removed the weak without direct violence. Medical experiments further deepened the horror. Some prisoners were deliberately infected, exposed to cold, or subjected to experimental treatments. These experiments were framed as research, but their purpose was cruelty and control. Pain was inflicted without consent. Death was recorded as data. Human beings were reduced to test subjects whose suffering served ideological and military goals. Psychological degradation accompanied physical destruction. The SS used arbitrary punishment to keep prisoners in a constant state of fear. Beatings were public. Executions were carried out within sight of others. Prisoners were forced to watch hangings, sometimes of men they knew personally. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, individuality meaningless, life disposable. Children and adolescents were not spared. Though fewer in number than in extermination camps, young prisoners at Gusen faced the same starvation and labor demands as adults. Their smaller bodies collapsed even faster. Many died within months. Others survived only because fellow prisoners shared scraps of food or shielded them during selections. Acts of solidarity that carried enormous risk. Yet even in this environment, human bonds persisted. Prisoners formed fragile networks of support, sharing food, warning one another of impending selections, or carrying the sick during roll call to prevent immediate execution. These acts rarely saved lives in the long term, but they preserved something essential: the refusal to become entirely dehumanized. Survival was not only physical, it was moral. By late 1944 and early 1945, conditions worsened dramatically. Transports from evacuated camps flooded Gusen, pushing the population far beyond any remaining capacity. Food supplies dwindled further. SS control became increasingly chaotic and violent. Death rates soared. The camp entered a state of uncontrolled collapse, where starvation and disease killed faster than selections could keep pace. Bodies piled up in barracks and courtyards. Crematoria could not process the dead quickly enough. Corpses were stacked, left uncovered, sometimes for days. Prisoners lived among the dead, stepping over bodies on their way to labor. Death lost its shock. It became part of the landscape. This was extermination without gas chambers. No single dramatic moment. No immediate finality. Just the steady grinding down of human life until nothing remained. Gusen demonstrated how genocide could be carried out through neglect as effectively as through execution. How a camp could kill thousands simply by withholding what was necessary to live. I end this segment. Gusen stands revealed not only as a place of forced labor, but as a machine of attrition, one that consumed human beings slowly, predictably, and deliberately. It was a system where death was not an accident or excess. It was the expected outcome. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The SS system: control, punishment, and the architecture of fear. Mauthausen-gusen did not function through chaos alone. Beneath the starvation, the exhaustion, and the death stood a carefully structured system of control designed by the SS to dominate, terrorize, and ultimately destroy the prisoners both physically and psychologically. Every movement inside the camp was regulated, every rule enforced through violence, and every moment shaped by fear. This was not accidental brutality. It was governance through terror, refined and maintained with bureaucratic precision. From the moment prisoners entered the camp system, they were absorbed into a hierarchy engineered to divide and weaken. Prisoners were assigned categories marked by colored triangles sewn onto their uniforms: political prisoners, Jews, so-called criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexuals, and others labeled asocial. These classifications were not symbolic. They determined food rations, labor assignments, exposure to violence, and chances of survival. The system ensured that prisoners did not see themselves as a single group, but as fragments competing for survival. At the top of this internal hierarchy were the capos, prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise labor details and barracks. Many capos were chosen from criminal categories and given power over others in exchange for privileges such as better food, clothing, or reduced labor. The SS understood that delegating brutality to prisoners multiplied its effectiveness. Violence no longer came only from guards. It came from fellow inmates desperate to retain their fragile advantages. Trust eroded. Solidarity became dangerous. Punishment at Gusen was constant and deliberately unpredictable. Minor infractions, working too slowly, standing incorrectly during roll call, speaking without permission, could result in savage beatings, confinement in punishment cells, or execution. Public punishment was a central tool. Prisoners were forced to witness hangings, floggings, and beatings, sometimes for hours, regardless of weather or physical condition. The goal was not only to punish the victim, but to terrorize the observers. One of the most feared instruments of punishment was standing cell confinement. Tiny spaces where prisoners were forced to stand upright for days without food or water. Others were subjected to the tree, where arms were bound behind the back and the body suspended, dislocating shoulders and tearing muscles. These punishments were designed to break bodies permanently, ensuring that even survivors would be incapable of resistance. Roll calls became rituals of domination. Prisoners stood for hours, sometimes at dawn, sometimes at night, regardless of weather. Sick and dying men were dragged from barracks to stand upright, supported by others to avoid immediate execution. If numbers did not match, due to escape, death, or administrative error, the entire camp could be held until the discrepancy was resolved. Men collapsed, froze, or died standing, their bodies counted only after life had left them. Execution was integrated seamlessly into daily camp life. Prisoners could be shot for alleged sabotage, resistance, or simply to instill fear. Some executions were staged as warnings, others carried out quietly. The condemned were stripped of identity even in death, bodies disposed of as waste, names erased from records, existence reduced to a line crossed off a list. The SS guards themselves operated within a rigid ideological framework. They were trained to view prisoners not as people, but as enemies, parasites, or expendable labor units. Dehumanization was reinforced constantly through language, ritual, and reward. Cruelty was encouraged. Mercy was punished. Guards who showed restraint risked suspicion. Those who demonstrated brutality were promoted. Architecture reinforced control. Barbed wire, watchtowers, electrified fences, and carefully planned sightlines ensured constant surveillance. Prisoners were always visible, always watched. There were no blind spots, no places of refuge. Even barracks interiors were arranged to maximize monitoring and discipline. Privacy did not exist. Rest did not exist. Silence was enforced when useful, and shattered when terror served better. Yet the most effective weapon of control was uncertainty. Prisoners never knew when punishment would come, who would be selected next, or whether survival today meant anything tomorrow. Hope was deliberately destabilized. Plans were impossible. Futures unimaginable. Life was reduced to the present moment, the next command, the next step, the next breath. Despite this, resistance flickered beneath the surface. Small acts, slowing work, hiding tools, sharing food, preserving dignity, challenged the SS system quietly. But these acts existed under constant threat. Discovery meant torture or death. Resistance at Gusen was not heroic spectacle. It was fragile, desperate, and often invisible. This segment reveals Mauthausen-gusen not simply as a place of suffering, but as a fully realized system of domination, a laboratory where terror was organized, delegated, and perfected. It shows how control does not require chaos alone, but structure. Rules enforced through fear, authority sustained through violence, and a system that turns victims into instruments of their own destruction. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Daily life in hell, starvation, disease, and the slow collapse of the body. If punishment was the language of control at Mauthausen-gusen, starvation was the method of execution. Death here did not usually arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, hollowing the body day by day, turning men into walking shadows long before they collapsed. Life inside the camp was structured to extract maximum labor while providing the minimum resources required to keep prisoners alive just long enough to be useful. Survival itself became a form of torture. Food rations were deliberately calculated not to sustain life, but to prolong suffering. A typical daily ration consisted of a watery soup made from turnips or cabbage, a piece of bread often mixed with sawdust or other fillers, and occasionally a thin smear of margarine or a spoonful of ersatz jam. The caloric intake was far below what was required for survival, let alone for men forced to perform exhausting physical labor for 12 to 14 hours a day. Hunger was constant, overwhelming, and consuming. Prisoners spoke of thinking about food every waking moment, dreaming of it at night, imagining recipes, recalling meals from their past lives as if reciting prayers. As the weeks passed, bodies began to consume themselves. Fat reserves vanished first, followed by muscle. Legs swelled with edema even as arms wasted away. Faces became skeletal, eyes sunken deep into skulls. Skin clung loosely to bone. Teeth loosened. Hair fell out. Wounds refused to heal. Minor cuts became infections. A cough could become a death sentence. Disease thrived in these conditions. Overcrowded barracks, lack of sanitation, contaminated water, and constant exhaustion created the perfect environment for epidemics. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia spread rapidly. Lice infested clothing and bedding. Prisoners scratched themselves until their skin bled. There was no effective medical care, only selections. Those deemed too weak to work were often sent to die, either through neglect, execution, or transfer to killing centers. The camp infirmary, when it existed, was not a place of healing. It functioned as a holding pen for the dying. Medicine was scarce or non-existent. Beds were overcrowded. Prisoners lay pressed together, delirious with fever, surrounded by the sounds of coughing, moaning, and death. Some were used for medical experiments. Others were simply left to rot. To be admitted to the infirmary was often a final step before disappearance. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Latrines overflowed. Prisoners were given seconds to relieve themselves under threat of beatings. Washing facilities were inadequate or frozen in winter. Clothing was rarely changed. Sweat, dirt, and excrement soaked into uniforms worn day and night. In winter, wet clothing froze to the body. In summer, infections spread rapidly through open sores. Sleep offered no refuge. Barracks were overcrowded far beyond capacity. Wooden bunks designed for 2 or 3 men held 5 or 6, sometimes more. Prisoners slept on bare boards or thin straw mattresses crawling with insects. The sick lay beside the dying. Movement at night was impossible without stepping on another body. Rest was shallow and constantly interrupted by guards, roll calls, or the cries of the suffering. Psychological collapse accompanied physical decline. Hunger and exhaustion stripped away personality, memory, and emotion. Men became irritable, withdrawn, or numb. Moral boundaries blurred. Theft of food, once unthinkable, became common. A crust of bread could determine life or death. Friendships were tested. Compassion survived only in fragments, often expressed quietly. A shared spoonful of soup, a whispered word, a body propped upright during roll call to avoid execution. Death became routine. Prisoners stepped over corpses on their way to work. Bodies lay in barracks until collected. Names were replaced by numbers. The dead were counted, recorded, and removed with mechanical efficiency. For those still alive, death was both feared and, at times, desired, an end to suffering that had no visible conclusion. Children and adolescents suffered no less. Young prisoners were subjected to the same labor demands, the same starvation, the same violence. Their growth stunted. Their bodies failed quickly. Many did not survive long enough to understand where they were. Yet even here, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners told stories to one another in whispers. They shared memories of home. Some recited poetry or prayed silently. These acts did not change their conditions, but they preserved something the camp sought to destroy completely: identity. This segment reveals daily life at Mauthausen-gusen not as a backdrop to violence, but as violence itself. Hunger was not an accident. Disease was not unavoidable. Overcrowding was not the result of poor planning. Every element of daily existence was designed to weaken, degrade, and eliminate. The camp did not need gas chambers to kill. It used time, deprivation, and despair, and for tens of thousands that was more than enough. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Selection, Exhaustion, and Death Without Gas Chambers. At Mauthausen-gusen, death did not require secrecy or speed. It was built into the rhythm of the camp itself. While other camps relied heavily on gas chambers to carry out mass murder, Mauthausen perfected something colder and more insidious: a system in which prisoners were worked, starved, and brutalized until their bodies simply failed. This was extermination by design, carried out openly, methodically, and without interruption. One of the central mechanisms of death was selection. These selections were not dramatic, singular events, but recurring processes woven into daily camp life. Prisoners were constantly evaluated by SS guards, capos, doctors, and administrators, not as human beings, but as expendable labor units. A man who stumbled during roll call, failed to keep pace on a work detail, collapsed from exhaustion, or showed visible signs of illness risked being marked. Weakness was not treated. It was punished. Selections often took place after labor assignments or during inspections. Prisoners were ordered to strip naked regardless of weather. Bodies were examined for signs of disease, emaciation, or injury. Those deemed unfit were separated without explanation. Some were sent to the camp infirmary, which, as many knew, was frequently a waiting room for death. Others were transported to Hartheim Castle, a former euthanasia center adapted to murder concentration camp prisoners deemed no longer useful. Few ever returned. For many, selection was unnecessary. The labor itself was lethal. Prisoners assigned to the quarries, construction sites, armaments factories, or underground tunnels were expected to perform at impossible levels. Guards set quotas knowing they could not be met. Failure resulted in beatings, extended work hours, or execution. Success offered no reward, only the chance to be worked again the next day. Exhaustion accumulated relentlessly. Muscles failed. Hearts gave out. Men collapsed mid-task and were either beaten back to their feet or left to die where they fell. In winter, exposure accelerated death. In summer, dehydration and heat stroke did the same. There was no pause, no recovery period, no recognition of human limits. Punishment remained omnipresent. Minor infractions, speaking out of turn, pausing too long, failing to salute, could result in brutal consequences. Prisoners were whipped, suspended by their arms, or forced to stand for hours in stress positions. Others were subjected to collective punishment, where entire blocks were deprived of food or sleep because of one person's alleged offense. The goal was not discipline but terror, to ensure obedience through constant fear. Public executions reinforced this control. Hangings were carried out in front of assembled prisoners. Victims were often accused of sabotage, escape attempts, or resistance, sometimes falsely, sometimes arbitrarily. The spectacle was deliberate. Prisoners were forced to watch, to absorb the lesson. Survival depended on submission, and even that offered no guarantee. Psychological destruction accompanied physical annihilation. Prisoners lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing whether the next inspection, the next work detail, or the next illness would mark their end. Hope was dangerous. Planning for the future felt meaningless. Time lost its structure. Days blurred into one another, defined only by hunger, labor, and fear. Yet even as the system crushed bodies and minds, it relied on participation. Capos, prisoners placed in supervisory roles, enforced discipline under threat of punishment themselves. Some abused their power brutally. Others attempted, quietly, to protect those under them when possible. This forced moral compromise was intentional. The SS understood that turning victims into instruments of control deepened the camp's corrosive effect. Children, elderly prisoners, and those considered undesirable suffered especially. They were often selected early, deemed inefficient from the outset. Their deaths required little justification. Their lives were never meant to last. By the time prisoners died, they were often beyond recognition. Reduced to numbers, their names erased from memory unless others carried them silently. Death was recorded, bodies removed, and work resumed. The system did not pause. It did not mourn. It simply continued. This segment exposes the final layer of Mauthausen-gusen's machinery of death, a system that did not depend on gas chambers to destroy tens of thousands. Instead, it used labor as a weapon, starvation as a policy, and exhaustion as an executioner. The camp's cruelty lay not only in how people were killed, but in how long they were forced to endure the process. At Mauthausen, death was not an event. It was the outcome of living there. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Nazi War Economy and the Expansion of Mauthausen-gusen. By the early 1940s, Mauthausen-gusen had fully transformed from a site of terror into a central pillar of the Nazi war economy. What began as a concentration camp built to crush political opponents had evolved into an industrial complex fueled by human suffering. The logic of the camp shifted subtly but decisively. Prisoners were no longer only enemies to be destroyed, but resources to be exploited until nothing remained. As Germany's war expanded across Europe, so did its demand for weapons, infrastructure, and labor. Millions of German men were pulled into military service, leaving factories understaffed and production strained. The solution, devised by Nazi planners, was forced labor on a massive scale. Concentration camps like Mauthausen were no longer peripheral to the war effort. They became essential. The SS Business and Administration Main Office, responsible for camp operations, entered contracts with private companies, state agencies, and armaments manufacturers. Human beings were leased as labor units. Prisoners were assigned numerical values, productivity expectations, and replacement timelines. If a worker died, another could be supplied. Death was factored into the system as a predictable cost. Mauthausen's location made it ideal for expansion. Situated near rail lines and raw materials, it became the center of a growing network of subcamps stretching across Austria. Gusen I, Gusen II, and Gusen III emerged as massive labor camps in their own right, holding tens of thousands of prisoners. Additional satellite camps were constructed near factories, quarries, and construction sites, each feeding directly into the German war machine. Prisoners were forced into industries critical to the Reich. They built roads, extracted stone, assembled aircraft parts, manufactured weapons, and dug underground facilities designed to protect production from Allied bombing. One of the most infamous projects involved tunneling deep into mountains to create hidden factories where jet aircraft components and armaments could be produced beyond the reach of air raids. The conditions inside these labor sites were even worse than in the main camp. Underground tunnels were dark, damp, and filled with dust that destroyed lungs. Air circulation was minimal. Accidents were constant. Explosions, cave-ins, and machinery failures killed without warning. Injured prisoners were rarely treated. Most were returned to work until they collapsed or were selected for death. Workdays stretched from dawn until nightfall, often 12 to 14 hours long, sometimes longer. Food rations remained starvation level, entirely insufficient for the energy demanded. Prisoners lost weight rapidly, muscles wasting away as bodies consumed themselves to survive another day. Many were reduced to skeletons within weeks of arrival. SS guards monitored productivity closely. Those who slowed down were beaten. Those who resisted were executed. Those who could not keep pace were marked as expendable. The ideology of death through labor was not symbolic. It was operational policy. The camp's purpose was not to preserve laborers, but to extract maximum output before death. Private companies benefited enormously. Firms such as Steyr-Daimler-Puch and Messerschmitt relied on prisoner labor supplied by Mauthausen and its subcamps. Corporate managers inspected work sites, demanded higher output, and requested more prisoners when productivity dropped. Few questioned the conditions. Fewer still objected. Profit and war needs eclipsed morality. For the SS, this system was doubly effective. It generated income and reinforced absolute control. The boundary between execution and employment disappeared. Work itself became the method of killing, allowing the regime to claim economic necessity while practicing extermination. Prisoners understood this reality. Many spoke later of realizing that survival depended not only on strength but on assignment. Some work details offered a slightly longer lifespan: kitchen labor, administrative tasks, or workshops sheltered from the elements. Others, like quarry labor or tunnel excavation, were widely recognized as death sentences. This knowledge fostered desperation and division. Prisoners competed for marginally safer jobs. Capos controlled access, often abusing power to favor some and destroy others. The system deliberately encouraged this fragmentation, preventing unity while extracting maximum labor. Yet even within this brutal framework, acts of resistance began to surface. Prisoners sabotaged machinery, slowed production subtly, damaged tools, and passed intelligence to resistance networks outside the camp when possible. These acts were dangerous and often fatal if discovered, but they represented a refusal to become fully complicit in the machinery of destruction. By 1944, Mauthausen-gusen had become one of the largest and most lethal forced labor complexes in Nazi-controlled Europe. Tens of thousands were dying each year, not in gas chambers, but on factory floors, in tunnels, and beneath quarry walls. The camp had achieved its grim efficiency, turning human lives into raw material for war. This segment reveals how Mauthausen-gusen was not only a site of terror, but an engine of exploitation, a place where modern industry and mass murder merged seamlessly. It stands as one of the clearest examples of how genocide was not separate from the Nazi state, but embedded deeply within its economic and administrative systems. In Mauthausen, the Reich did not merely kill its victims. It used them, until there was nothing left to use. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Life inside the labor system. Hunger, violence, and control. Inside Mauthausen-gusen, forced labor was not simply work imposed on prisoners. It was the structure around which every aspect of life revolved. From the moment a prisoner woke to the moment they collapsed onto wooden bunks at night, every hour was shaped by exhaustion, hunger, fear, and surveillance. The camp functioned like a factory whose raw material was human bodies, and whose output was both war production and death. Each day began before dawn. Sirens or shouted orders tore prisoners from shallow, restless sleep. Barracks were overcrowded far beyond design limits, with men stacked on bunks 3 or 4 levels high. There was little room to move, no privacy, and no warmth in winter. Many woke already exhausted, having spent the night coughing, shivering, or pressed against others in an attempt to retain body heat. Illness spread rapidly in these conditions, but sickness offered no exemption from work. Roll call followed. Prisoners were forced to stand outside for hours, regardless of weather, while SS guards counted and recounted them. Those who collapsed were beaten, sometimes to death, as an example. Bodies of prisoners who had died overnight were dragged from the barracks and counted among the living, propped upright to ensure numbers matched. Accuracy mattered more than humanity. Food rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to prolong suffering. A thin liquid, often called soup, made from turnips or rotten vegetables, formed the main meal. Bread rations were minimal and often moldy. Meat was rare. Fat was nearly non-existent. The caloric intake was far below what was required for heavy labor, ensuring that prisoners slowly starved even as they worked. Hunger dominated every thought. Prisoners spoke of dreaming of food, of measuring time not in days but in meals. Some risked their lives to steal potato peels or scraps from garbage pits. Others chewed grass, leaves, or sawdust to quiet their stomachs. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, slowed healing, and left bodies vulnerable to disease and injury. Work details were assigned with ruthless efficiency. The most punishing labor, quarries, tunnels, stone hauling, was given to those considered politically dangerous, racially inferior, or already weakened. Prisoners carried heavy stones up steep stairways, their hands bleeding, their backs bent under crushing weight. Falling was common. Those who dropped stones were beaten or pushed aside, sometimes thrown down the steps deliberately. SS guards enforced discipline through constant violence. Beatings were arbitrary and public. Punishment blocks awaited those accused of sabotage, insubordination, or simply being disliked by a guard or capo. Prisoners were whipped, hung by their arms, confined in tiny cells without food, or forced to stand motionless for hours. Punishment was not corrective, it was terrorizing. The capo system intensified this brutality. Selected from among prisoners, often criminals, Capos were granted authority over work details in exchange for maintaining order and productivity. Many abused this power, knowing their own survival depended on pleasing the SS. They beat fellow prisoners, withheld food, and controlled access to slightly safer tasks. The system turned victims against each other, eroding solidarity and trust. Medical care existed in name only. The camp infirmary was overcrowded and under-resourced. Doctors, themselves prisoners, lacked medicine, bandages, or proper equipment. Many inmates avoided reporting injuries or illness, knowing that weakness could lead to selection for execution. For some, the infirmary became a waiting room for death. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia thrived in overcrowded, filthy conditions. Lice infested clothing and bedding. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Washing facilities were inadequate, and sanitation systems frequently failed. The stench of decay clung to the camp, a constant reminder of how close death was. Psychological control was as important as physical suffering. Prisoners were stripped of names and reduced to numbers. Heads were shaved. Personal belongings were confiscated. Family ties, professions, identities all erased. This systematic dehumanization made violence easier for guards and despair harder to escape for prisoners. Yet even in this environment, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared food when they could, whispered encouragement, and remembered birthdays or religious holidays in secret. Small acts, a glance, a word, a gesture became lifelines. These moments did not undo the system, but they challenged its goal of total domination. As the war intensified, labor demands increased further. Prisoners already near collapse were pushed harder. Accidents rose. Death rates soared. The SS responded not by easing conditions, but by demanding replacements. New transports arrived, bringing fresh bodies to sustain production and absorb mortality. By this stage, Mauthausen-gusen had perfected a cycle: arrival, exploitation, collapse, death. There was no exit except survival through chance or liberation yet to come. The system was designed so that suffering was constant and death inevitable for many. This segment exposes the daily reality of death through labor, not as a slogan, but as lived experience. Mauthausen did not rely on a single moment of killing. It relied on endless days of exhaustion, hunger, violence, and despair, repeated until bodies failed. In this way, the camp turned time itself into a weapon. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Breaking the body, breaking the will, death as a daily outcome. By the time a prisoner had spent weeks or months inside the Mauthausen-gusen system, the camp no longer needed dramatic violence to kill. The machinery of suffering had done its work. Bodies weakened by starvation, minds dulled by terror, and spirits crushed by hopeless routine were already moving toward collapse. Death became less an event and more a condition that hovered constantly, shaping every decision, every movement, every breath. Physical deterioration was inevitable. Prisoners lost weight at an alarming pace. Cheekbones protruded sharply. Eyes sank deep into skulls. Muscles wasted away until limbs looked skeletal beneath striped uniforms. Small wounds festered without treatment, turning into infections that spread quickly through weakened bodies. A minor cut from stonework or machinery could become fatal within days. The quarry was the final stage for many. Prisoners forced to haul granite blocks far beyond their strength often collapsed mid-task. Those who could no longer rise were beaten, kicked, or dragged aside to die. Others were deliberately pushed over ledges or down stairways. These deaths were not hidden, they were meant to be seen. Fear was the most efficient tool the SS possessed. Execution was woven seamlessly into daily life. Some prisoners were shot outright. Others were hanged in public squares as warnings. Injections of phenol directly into the heart became a routine method of killing those deemed unfit for work. Gas vans and improvised killing rooms were used at times, but more often death came quietly, through exhaustion and neglect, leaving little trace beyond another empty bunk. Selections occurred regularly. SS doctors or guards would walk through work details or barracks, pointing silently. Those selected knew what it meant. The criteria were arbitrary: a limp, a cough, a moment of weakness. Once marked, prisoners were removed from the population, often under the pretense of medical care. Few returned. The crematoria could not always keep pace with the number of dead. Bodies piled up near barracks or work sites. In winter, frozen corpses lay stacked like logs. The smell of burning flesh became a constant presence, drifting through the camp, settling into clothing and lungs. Prisoners learned to recognize it instinctively. Psychological breakdown accompanied physical collapse. Many prisoners reached a state of emotional numbness, a survival mechanism. Others experienced hallucinations, delirium, or deep depression. Suicide was not uncommon. Some deliberately stepped out of line during roll call, knowing the punishment would be fatal. Others threw themselves against electric fences. These acts were not despair alone. They were attempts to reclaim control over a life already stolen. Children and teenagers suffered uniquely. Many were forced into labor beyond their capacity. Others were used for experimentation or kept alive only temporarily. Their mortality rates were devastatingly high. Those who survived often did so through the protection of older prisoners or underground networks that hid them during selections. Despite the omnipresence of death, the SS insisted on order. Paperwork was meticulously maintained. Deaths were recorded with falsified causes: heart failure, pneumonia, exhaustion, as if mass murder could be reduced to clerical routine. Numbers mattered more than names. Efficiency mattered more than truth. The camp structure ensured that guilt was diffused. Guards followed orders. Capos enforced discipline. Administrators filed reports. Industrial partners received shipments. Each participant could claim distance from the final act of killing, even as the system depended on everyone's participation. And yet, resistance persisted, subtle, fragile, but real. Prisoners sabotaged machinery, slowed work, hid tools, shared intelligence. Some documented crimes secretly, preserving evidence for a future they might never see. These acts carried enormous risk, but they were acts of defiance against a system designed to erase individuality. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, conditions worsened further. Supplies dwindled. Evacuation plans were chaotic. The SS grew more brutal, desperate to maintain control and erase evidence. Death marches loomed, promising survival rates no better than the camp itself. By this stage, Mauthausen-gusen had achieved its purpose as envisioned by the Nazi regime. A place where human beings were reduced to expendable units, where death was not an exception but the expected outcome of participation. This segment reveals the final truth of death through labor. It was not a metaphor. It was a calculated process that transformed work into a slow execution, stretched across days, weeks, and months, until bodies failed and silence followed. In the next chapter, we move toward the camp's final phase: evacuation, collapse, and the moment when the system of terror began to unravel under the weight of its own crimes. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The camp expands. Mauthausen-gusen and the industrialization of suffering. By the early 1940s, Mauthausen was no longer a single camp. It had become the core of a vast, expanding system, a network of subcamps designed to extract every possible ounce of labor from prisoners before their bodies failed completely. The most notorious of these was Gusen, but it was only the beginning. As the war intensified and Germany's demand for labor exploded, The Mauthausen-gusen complex grew into one of the largest and deadliest concentration camp systems in the Third Reich. This expansion was not chaotic. It was deliberate, calculated, and tightly integrated into the Nazi war economy. Where other camps served mixed purposes, detention, terror, forced labor, Mauthausen and its subcamps were built around one principle above all others: total exploitation. Prisoners were not expected to survive. They were expected to work until they died. Gusenai was established in 1940, only a few kilometers from Mauthausen, but its conditions were even worse. From the beginning, Gusen was intended as a place of annihilation. Prisoners there were subjected to harsher labor quotas, longer working hours, and more brutal discipline. Mortality rates at Gusen were often higher than at the main camp. Many SS officers openly referred to it as a death camp, even though gas chambers were not yet central to its operation. As Germany invaded and occupied more of Europe, the prisoner population changed. Political opponents from Poland, Spain, France, and later the Soviet Union arrived in massive numbers. Soviet prisoners of war were treated with particular cruelty. Many were executed immediately. Others were worked to death under conditions deliberately designed to eliminate them as quickly as possible. The Nazi racial hierarchy dictated who lived briefly and who died immediately. Industry followed the camps. Private companies, state enterprises, and arms manufacturers partnered directly with the SS. Quarries expanded. Factories were built beside barbed wire. Underground tunnels were carved into hillsides to protect weapons production from Allied bombing. Each new facility required labor, and the SS provided it, unpaid, expendable, and endlessly replaceable. The arrival of industrial contracts transformed daily life inside the camps. Workdays grew longer. Food rations shrank further. Injuries increased as exhausted prisoners handled heavy machinery without training or protection. Accidents were not treated as tragedies. They were treated as inefficiencies. A dead worker could always be replaced by the next transport. New subcamps emerged rapidly. Gusen II, Gusen III, and dozens of satellite camps spread across Austria and southern Germany. Some housed only a few hundred prisoners. Others held thousands. Conditions varied, but the outcome rarely did. Overcrowding, starvation, disease, and violence were constant across the entire system. Transportation between camps became a weapon of suffering in itself. Prisoners were marched or transported in open rail cars without food or water. Many died en route. Survivors arrived already weakened, immediately assigned to labor without rest. The system allowed no recovery. Weakness was punished. Collapse was fatal. The SS maintained strict control through terror and unpredictability. Rules changed without warning. Punishments were arbitrary. A prisoner could be beaten or executed not for breaking rules, but for appearing insufficiently obedient. Capos, often prisoners themselves elevated to positions of power, enforced discipline with brutality, knowing their own survival depended on cruelty. Medical care existed only in name. Camp infirmaries were places of death rather than healing. Prisoners deemed unfit for work were often selected for execution rather than treatment. Experiments were conducted under the guise of medical research, further reducing human beings to disposable test subjects. Despite these conditions, the camps continued to expand. The logic of the system fed itself. As labor demands increased, so did arrests and deportations. As prisoners died, more were brought in. The camps became self-sustaining engines of destruction, fueled by ideology, bureaucracy, and economic demand. By 1943, Mauthausen-gusen stood at the center of a vast network where death was not hidden. It was normalized. The sight of bodies, the sound of beatings, the smell of crematoria. These were no longer shocking. They were routine. The extraordinary had become ordinary. This segment marks a turning point in the story. What began as a single camp had become an industrial system of annihilation, integrated into the very machinery of war. In the next segment, we will descend deeper into the underground factories, secret weapons projects, and the final evolution of death through labor as the war entered its most desperate phase. Chapter 6, Segment 2. Underground factories and the final evolution of death through labor. As Allied bombers began to tear through German cities and industrial centers in 1943, the Nazi leadership faced a crisis. The war economy depended on weapons production, but factories above ground were no longer safe. The solution was as ruthless as it was ambitious. Move industry underground, and use concentration camp prisoners to carve it out of solid rock. Nowhere was this transformation more extreme than within the Mauthausen-gusen camp system. Beneath forests, hillsides, and abandoned quarries, prisoners were forced to dig vast tunnel complexes by hand. Pickaxes, shovels, bare fingers. These were the tools of men already starving, already exhausted. The work was constant. Shifts lasted 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours. Air was thin, dust choked the lungs, and cave-ins were frequent. There were no safety measures. If a tunnel collapsed, those buried inside were not rescued. They were sealed in and forgotten. The most infamous of these underground projects was Bergerstall near Gusen. Here, prisoners excavated enormous halls to house the production of Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters. Advanced weapons meant to turn the tide of the war. The irony was absolute. Cutting-edge technology built by human beings reduced to less than animals. The aircraft represented modernity and innovation, while the labor behind them was medieval in its brutality. Inside the tunnels, conditions were even worse than above ground. Prisoners worked in perpetual darkness under harsh artificial lights. Temperatures were extreme, freezing in winter, suffocating in summer. Exhaust fumes from machinery filled the air. Many prisoners collapsed where they stood. Others were beaten until they rose again, or dragged aside and replaced. Food rations did not increase despite the intensified labor. In fact, they often decreased. The SS calculated rations based not on survival, but on minimal productivity. Once a prisoner's output declined, he was marked for elimination. This was the purest form of death through labor. Work was not a means to an end, but the method of killing itself. Medical selection became more systematic. Prison doctors, following SS orders, identified prisoners deemed unfit for work. These men were removed from the tunnels and sent back to the main camp, where many were executed, left to die in infirmaries, or murdered via lethal injection. Others were sent to Hartheim Castle, one of the Nazi euthanasia centers, where gassing techniques perfected earlier were reused on camp prisoners. Violence escalated as the war situation worsened. SS guards grew more brutal, more unpredictable. Executions were carried out in public as warnings. Prisoners accused of sabotage, often without evidence, were hanged before their fellow inmates. Even accidental damage to equipment could mean death. Transportation between underground sites and main camps became a daily march of suffering. Prisoners stumbled through snow, mud, and rain in thin clothing, many without shoes. Those who fell behind were beaten or shot. Corpses were left along the roads as silent markers of the system's efficiency. By late 1944, the population of the Mauthausen-gusen complex swelled to catastrophic levels. Evacuations from camps closer to the front flooded the system with tens of thousands of new prisoners. Jews from Hungary, resistance fighters from across Europe, Soviet prisoners of war. Barracks overflowed. Disease spread uncontrollably. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed as many as labor itself. The SS made no effort to slow the process. On the contrary, destruction accelerated. As defeat loomed, the camps became places not only of exploitation, but of erasure. Records were destroyed. Bodies were burned day and night. Mass graves were hastily filled. The goal was no longer victory, it was concealment. Yet even in this abyss, traces of resistance remained. Prisoners sabotaged machinery when they could, weakening weapons production in small but meaningful ways. Others shared food, whispered information, or helped the sick survive one more day. These acts were dangerous and rare, but they mattered. They were assertions of humanity inside a system designed to annihilate it. By the beginning of 1945, the underground factories were still operating, but the camp system was cracking. Supplies dwindled, guards deserted, command structures frayed. The machinery of death began to grind unevenly, not because it had lost its purpose, but because it was finally running out of time. This segment reveals the final evolution of Mauthausen's mission, a place where human life was consumed to fuel a dying war. In the next segment, we will follow the collapse of this system, the evacuations, death marches, and the final days before liberation, when death through labor gave way to death through chaos. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Collapse, Evacuation, and the Final Days of the Mauthausen-gusen System. By early 1945, the Mauthausen-gusen camp system was no longer functioning as a controlled mechanism of exploitation. It was collapsing into something even more lethal, a landscape of starvation, disease, panic, and unrestrained violence. The ideology of death through labor had reached its final phase, where work, killing, and neglect merged into one continuous process of destruction. As the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied forces closed in from the west, Nazi authorities ordered the evacuation of camps across occupied Europe. Trains and columns of prisoners poured into Mauthausen and its subcamps from Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, Flossenburg, and elsewhere. These were not organized transfers, they were floods of human wreckage. Prisoners arrived skeletal, sick, half-dead from death marches that had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. The camp population exploded far beyond capacity. Barracks designed for a few hundred men now held over 1,000. Many slept standing, pressed against one another for warmth. Others collapsed in courtyards, stairwells, or latrines and never rose again. Food supplies all but disappeared. The daily ration, already insufficient, shrank into thin soup and scraps of bread that could no longer sustain life. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis swept through the camp with terrifying speed. The infirmaries were death traps, overcrowded, filthy, without medicine or care. Prison doctors, themselves inmates, were forced to decide who might survive another day and who would be left to die. SS medical staff no longer pretended to offer treatment. Selection for death became routine. The crematoria could no longer keep up. Corpses piled in barracks, corridors, and open fields. In winter cold, bodies froze where they fell. In warmer days, the stench of decay filled the camp. Prisoners were forced to carry the dead, friends, brothers, strangers, to mass burial pits or cremation sites, often collapsing under the weight of bodies heavier than their own wasted frames. SS discipline disintegrated. Some guards abandoned their posts and fled. Others became more violent than ever, venting rage and fear on prisoners who could no longer even pretend to resist. Random shootings became common. Beatings escalated. Executions were carried out without record or justification. The camp existed in a state of lethal anarchy, where survival depended almost entirely on chance. Death marches radiated outward from the camp system. Thousands were forced onto roads leading deeper into Bavaria and Austria, marched through snow and rain with no food, no shelter, and no medical care. Those who collapsed were shot on the spot. Villages along the routes became witnesses to crimes they could neither stop nor forget. Bodies lining ditches, fields, and forest edges. Inside Mauthausen itself, whispers of liberation spread. Prisoners listened for distant artillery, for aircraft overhead, for any sign that the war was ending. Some dared to hope. Others, too exhausted to imagine survival, waited in silence. Resistance groups inside the camp prepared quietly, hiding weapons, planning to prevent mass executions in the final hours. In late April, the SS began destroying evidence. Documents were burned. Files vanished. Orders were issued to kill remaining prisoners if Allied forces approached too closely. But the system was breaking faster than commands could be enforced. Communication failed. Supplies ran out. Authority crumbled. On the 5th of May, 1945, American forces of the 11th Armored Division reached Mauthausen. They entered a place beyond anything they had been prepared to see. Skeletal survivors stumbled toward them, barely able to stand. Barracks were filled with the dead and dying. Open pits overflowed with bodies. The living and the dead were indistinguishable at first glance. Liberation did not mean immediate salvation. Thousands were still dying from disease, starvation, and shock. Medical teams worked desperately to stabilize survivors. Improper feeding could be fatal. Typhus threatened to spread beyond the camp. Emergency hospitals were established. Order had to be restored where none had existed. For the survivors, liberation was not joy, it was disbelief. Many had lived so long under terror that freedom felt unreal. Others collapsed as soon as the SS were gone, their bodies finally surrendering after years of abuse. Children who had grown up inside the camp stared at soldiers without understanding what peace meant. The aftermath revealed the scale of the crime. Investigators documented mass graves, execution sites, and the vast network of subcamps that had fed the Nazi war machine with human lives. Testimony poured in. Survivors spoke of quarries, tunnels, beatings, starvation, and the endless calculus of survival. Mauthausen became evidence, not just of murder, but of a system that used labor as a weapon of annihilation. This final segment of Chapter 6 marks the end of Mauthausen as an operational camp, but not the end of its meaning. The system collapsed under its own cruelty, leaving behind ruins, memories, and a warning written in human lives. In the next chapter, we will turn to liberation's aftermath, the struggle to save the survivors, the pursuit of justice, and the question the world was forced to confront. How a modern society had built a place where work itself became a method of mass murder. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Liberation, Medical Catastrophe, and the Struggle to Save the Living. Liberation did not arrive at Mauthausen-gusen as a moment of celebration. It arrived as a medical and humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time. When American forces entered the camp in early May 1945, they did not find a population ready to be freed. They found tens of thousands of human beings already standing at the edge of death, many of whom would not survive even with rescue. The SS guards were gone or hiding. The camp gates stood open. But inside, the system of destruction had left behind a reality far more complex than victory or relief. Survivors were skeletal, infected, delirious, and incapable of basic bodily functions. Many had not eaten solid food in weeks. Others were suffering from advanced typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. Liberation had come too late for thousands whose bodies had already crossed the point of recovery. American soldiers were unprepared for what they encountered. Hardened by months of combat, they were still shaken by the sights and smells of Mauthausen. Barracks packed with corpses, survivors lying beside the dead, too weak to move. Open pits filled with bodies. The odor of decay hung permanently in the air. Soldiers described the camp as something beyond war, a place where death had been engineered into daily routine. Medical officers quickly realized that saving lives required restraint as much as action. Many survivors begged for food, driven by starvation instincts that could not be safely indulged. Refeeding syndrome, unknown to many at the time, posed a lethal risk. Sudden intake of rich food could cause organ failure. Careful rationing, thin soups, and controlled nutrition became essential. Even liberation carried deadly consequences if handled improperly. Emergency hospitals were set up inside and outside the camp. Local buildings were requisitioned. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock with limited supplies. Prisoner doctors, themselves barely alive, assisted where possible. American medics confronted diseases they had rarely encountered in such scale. Epidemic typhus spread by lice, advanced malnutrition, infected wounds untreated for years. The camp had to be quarantined. Typhus threatened to spread beyond the wire. Delousing stations were created. Clothing was burned. Survivors were washed, shaved, disinfected. Processes that were necessary for survival but terrifying for people who had been brutalized by forced undressing and humiliation for years. Even kindness could trigger trauma. Many prisoners died after liberation. Their bodies, unable to adapt to nourishment or medicine, simply gave out. For survivors, this was devastating. Freedom arrived hand in hand with loss. Friends who had endured everything together died days or weeks after the gates opened. Survival felt arbitrary, determined not by strength, morality, or will, but by biological chance. Children posed a particular challenge. Some had been born inside the camp system. Others had arrived as teenagers and now appeared decades older. They were malnourished, traumatized, and deeply distrustful of authority. Many had no families to return to. Liberation did not answer the question of where they belonged, only that the camp was no longer their prison. As order was restored, the scale of Mauthausen-gusen's crimes became clearer. Investigators began documenting mass graves, execution sites, quarries, tunnels, and subcamps. Survivors were interviewed. Their testimonies were recorded urgently, before memory faded or death intervened. What emerged was not chaos, but pattern. A deliberate system of destruction through labor, starvation, and terror. The camp was transformed into evidence. Photographs were taken. Film crews documented conditions. Medical reports were compiled. Names of perpetrators were collected. Survivors identified guards, capos, and SS officers. The world would need proof not just to understand what had happened, but to prevent denial. For the survivors, liberation was psychologically overwhelming. Many had lived under constant threat for so long that freedom felt unreal. Some refused to leave the camp, fearing the outside world. Others wandered aimlessly, unsure where to go. Home often no longer existed. Families murdered, cities destroyed, borders redrawn. American forces attempted to provide structure. Survivor committees were formed. Temporary governance emerged. International aid organizations arrived. Slowly, painfully, the process of survival began, not the return to life, but the reconstruction of identity after total dehumanization. Mauthausen had been built to break human beings into tools and corpses. Liberation revealed something the SS had failed to erase: memory. The survivors carried knowledge of how the system worked, how cruelty was normalized, how labor became lethal. Their testimony would soon move beyond the camp and into courtrooms, archives, and history. This first segment of Chapter 7 focuses not on the end of suffering, but on the moment when suffering became visible to the world. Liberation exposed the cost of death through labor, not as an abstract policy, but as thousands of living bodies struggling to remain alive. In the next segment, we will examine how justice was pursued, The trials, the punishments, the failures, and the uncomfortable truths about accountability in the aftermath of one of the most brutal camp systems in Nazi Germany. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Investigation, Trials, and the Search for Accountability. As the immediate crisis of survival slowly stabilized inside Mauthausen-gusen, a second and equally difficult process began: the pursuit of justice. Liberation had revealed the crime scene, but understanding how to respond to it required something the world had never attempted before: holding an entire system of mass murder legally accountable. American forces quickly recognized that Mauthausen was not an aberration, but a central pillar of the Nazi camp network. Its purpose, scale, and administrative precision demanded formal investigation. War crimes units entered the camp almost immediately, documenting every detail before evidence could be lost. Graves were measured, crematoria were examined, quarry sites were mapped, subcamp records were seized. Every structure was treated not as a building, but as a witness. Survivors were asked to testify, often while still weak, traumatized, and uncertain whether anyone would believe them. Many spoke despite exhaustion, driven by a fear that silence would allow the truth to disappear just as their families had. Testimonies described starvation rations calculated to kill, labor quotas designed to exhaust, executions disguised as discipline, and medical abuse framed as treatment. What emerged was not only brutality, but intent. The Mauthausen trials began in late 1945, conducted by U.S. military tribunals at Dachau. Unlike later international proceedings, these trials focused specifically on crimes committed at Mauthausen and its subcamps. Defendants included SS officers, camp administrators, guards, and kapos men who had directly enforced the system of extermination through labor. The trials introduced a concept that would become foundational to modern war crimes law: that obedience to orders was not a defense for crimes against humanity. Many defendants argued they had merely followed regulations, enforced discipline, or maintained order. Prosecutors countered with evidence showing that the system itself was criminal, designed to kill, not detain. Survivor testimony played a decisive role. Witnesses identified guards who had beaten prisoners to death, overseers who had pushed men into the quarry abyss, doctors who had denied care deliberately, and administrators who had signed orders knowing their consequences. These testimonies were often emotionally devastating, both for those who spoke and those who listened. The trials resulted in dozens of death sentences and long prison terms. Camp commandants and senior officers were held responsible for policies that transformed labor into execution. Lower-ranking guards were convicted for direct participation in murder and abuse. Some kapos were prosecuted as collaborators, though this raised complex moral questions, victims forced into power positions to survive. Yet justice was incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped accountability. Some blended into post-war society. Others were protected by bureaucratic confusion, lack of evidence, or Cold War priorities that soon shifted focus away from prosecution. The machinery of justice moved slower than the machinery of destruction had. For survivors, the trials were both validation and disappointment. They confirmed that the world acknowledged what had happened, but they also revealed how limited justice could be when measured against mass death. No sentence could restore lives lost. No courtroom could fully capture the scale of suffering. Beyond legal punishment, another struggle emerged: preserving memory. Mauthausen was not immediately transformed into a memorial. In the early post-war years, Europe was focused on rebuilding, not remembering. Former camps were repurposed, neglected, or politically contested. Survivors feared that silence would again bury the truth. Former prisoners organized associations, wrote memoirs, and returned to the camp to demand recognition. They fought for plaques, museums, and official acknowledgement. For them, memory was not symbolic. It was survival's final duty. To forget Mauthausen would mean allowing its logic to remain unchallenged. Investigators concluded that Mauthausen-gusen was one of the most lethal labor camp systems ever created. Its mortality rate rivaled extermination camps, despite the absence of gas chambers on the same scale. Death came through exhaustion, starvation, exposure, and brutality, methods that could be disguised as work, punishment, or discipline. This distinction mattered. It demonstrated that genocide did not require gas chambers alone. It could be accomplished through bureaucracy, quotas, and indifference. Mauthausen proved that mass murder could hide behind productivity. The trials helped establish a historical record that would later support broader Holocaust prosecutions and international human rights law. Concepts such as crimes against humanity, collective responsibility, and command accountability were sharpened by cases like Mauthausen. The camp became a reference point for understanding how legal systems must respond to systematic cruelty. Still, justice remained fragile. As years passed, witnesses died, records faded, and public attention shifted. Denial and minimization emerged. Survivors once again found themselves defending the truth, this time against forgetting rather than violence. Chapter 7, Segment 2 is about accountability, not as a completed task, but as an ongoing struggle. The liberation of Mauthausen ended the physical system of death through labor, but the moral reckoning continues across generations. In the final segment of this chapter, we will examine legacy, how Mauthausen-gusen is remembered today, how its lessons are taught, and why its warning remains urgently relevant in a world where systems of dehumanization still exist. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Legacy, Memory, and the Warning Left Behind. When the trials ended and the headlines faded, Mauthausen-gusen entered its most fragile phase, the long struggle against forgetting. The camp had been dismantled as a functioning machine of death, but its meaning was far from secure. Memory, unlike barbed wire or crematoria, could be dismantled quietly. In the years immediately following the war, Mauthausen stood at the edge of two competing realities. For survivors, it was sacred ground, a cemetery without graves, a place where the dead spoke through silence. For governments rebuilding shattered nations, it was an inconvenient reminder of a past many wanted to move beyond. For some local communities, it was simply land, scarred, yes, but still land. Much of the Gusen complex was destroyed soon after liberation. Barracks were torn down. Quarries were reopened. Housing developments rose where thousands had died. In some places, families unknowingly built homes over mass graves. This erasure was not always malicious, but it was devastating. Survivors watched the physical evidence of genocide vanish under concrete and grass. Mauthausen itself survived largely because former prisoners refused to let it disappear. They returned year after year, marking anniversaries, placing stones, erecting memorials with their own hands. They wrote letters, petitioned governments, and documented what they had seen before their voices were lost to time. Without their persistence, even the main camp might have been forgotten. The memorial that eventually emerged did not tell a simple story. Could not. Mauthausen was not defined by a single method of killing or one group of victims. It was a system layered, bureaucratic, and adaptable. Political prisoners were worked to death alongside Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, Spanish Republicans, homosexuals, and those labeled asocial. Suffering was organized, but it was not uniform. One of the most difficult legacies of Mauthausen-gusen was confronting the idea that genocide could be disguised as labor. The camp challenged the public's understanding of how mass murder occurs. There were no immediate spectacles of gas chambers for many prisoners. Instead, there were schedules, quotas, punishments, and starvation rations. Death arrived gradually, efficiently, and legally. This made Mauthausen especially dangerous to forget. Its lessons were subtle and therefore easier to ignore. It demonstrated that genocide does not always announce itself with dramatic violence. Sometimes it arrives through administrative language, economic necessity, and obedience framed as duty. Educators who later brought students to the site faced a challenge: how to explain a camp where death came through exhaustion rather than immediate execution. The answer lay not in statistics alone, but in understanding intent. Mauthausen was designed so that prisoners could not survive. Labor was not rehabilitation. It was a sentence carried out over weeks or months instead of minutes. Survivor testimony became the bridge between the past and future. Memoirs, interviews, and recorded accounts transformed memory into evidence. These voices described the sound of boots on gravel, the weight of stones on broken shoulders, the silence of roll calls where the dead were counted as if still alive. They described how hope was measured not in years, but in hours. As the Holocaust entered global consciousness, Mauthausen gained recognition as one of the most lethal concentration camps in the Nazi system. Scholars documented its role in the war economy, its place within SS hierarchy, and its relationship to other camps. The phrase extermination through labor became inseparable from its name. Yet recognition did not guarantee understanding. In a world increasingly distant from World War II, Mauthausen risked becoming an abstraction, another tragic sight among many. Survivors warned against this. They insisted that the camp's meaning was not confined to history books. It was a warning about how quickly societies could normalize cruelty when systems rewarded obedience over conscience. The camp also forced confrontation with uncomfortable questions. How many people participated without killing directly? How many followed orders while believing they were merely doing their jobs? How many benefited from forced labor while claiming ignorance? Mauthausen revealed that atrocity does not require universal hatred, only widespread compliance. Today, the memorial stands as a place of reflection rather than explanation. It does not overwhelm visitors with spectacle. Instead, it confronts them with emptiness. Wide spaces where barracks once stood, staircases carved by dying men, walls that absorbed screams now replaced by wind. The absence is intentional. It demands imagination and therefore responsibility. For descendants of victims, Mauthausen is not history, it is inheritance. Names etched into stone represent futures that never unfolded. Languages silenced. Families erased. Each visit is both an act of mourning and defiance against erasure. Chapter 7, Segment 3 closes the story of justice not with resolution, but with obligation. Mauthausen-gusen teaches that accountability does not end in courtrooms. It continues in education, remembrance, and vigilance. The system that killed tens of thousands was built step by step, and systems can be rebuilt if warnings are ignored. In the final chapters of this documentary, we will turn fully to reflection, how Mauthausen fits into the broader machinery of the Holocaust, what it reveals about power and obedience, and why remembering death through labor is essential in a world where exploitation still hides behind policy and progress. Mauthausen was not an accident. It was a design, and designs can be repeated unless they are understood. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Mauthausen within the Holocaust system. How one camp fit into a continent of death. By the time Mauthausen reached its most lethal years, it was no longer an isolated site of cruelty. It had become a critical node inside a vast, interconnected system that stretched across Nazi-occupied Europe, a system designed not only to imprison and kill, but to extract value from human destruction itself. To understand Mauthausen fully, it must be placed within the larger architecture of the Holocaust, where camps were not random expressions of brutality, but carefully categorized tools serving different functions inside a single ideological machine. The Nazi camp network was never uniform. Some camps were designed primarily for immediate extermination, others for detention, transit, punishment, or forced labor. Mauthausen occupied a unique and especially dangerous position within this hierarchy. It was classified as a Category 3 camp, reserved for prisoners deemed irredeemable enemies of the Reich. This classification alone carried a death sentence. Prisoners sent to Mauthausen were not expected to survive, and the camp structure reflected that expectation in every detail. Unlike extermination camps such as Treblinka or Belzec, where victims were murdered within hours of arrival, Mauthausen killed through duration. It was slow, deliberate, and bureaucratically clean. Prisoners were worked until their bodies collapsed, then replaced by new arrivals shipped in by rail. The absence of gas chambers in the early years did not make the camp less deadly. It made death quieter, spread out over time, and easier to rationalize as labor losses. This distinction mattered deeply to the Nazi leadership. Forced labor camps like Mauthausen allowed the regime to present mass death as economic necessity. Prisoners became inputs in production equations, their lives measured against stone output, weapons quotas, and construction deadlines. When death rates soared, they were recorded not as murders, but as inefficiencies or unavoidable attrition. Mauthausen's quarry connected it directly to the Nazi war economy. The granite extracted by dying prisoners was used in monumental building projects envisioned by Hitler and Albert Speer, architecture meant to symbolize the permanence of the Third Reich. Even as Germany's military situation worsened, prisoners continued hauling stone for dreams that would never be completed. Their suffering was fuel for an ideology obsessed with endurance and domination. As the war expanded, Mauthausen's role grew. It absorbed prisoners from across Europe, resistance fighters from France and Poland, Spanish Republicans who had fled Franco only to be captured by the Nazis, Soviet prisoners of war marked for extermination, Jews deported from ghettos, and civilians seized during reprisals. Each transport brought new languages, new faces, and new deaths. The camp's sub-camp system transformed it into a regional labor empire. Gusen, Melk, Ebensee, and dozens of smaller sites fed prisoners into factories, tunnels, and construction projects tied directly to armaments production. Underground complexes were carved out to protect weapons manufacturing from Allied bombing, and prisoners were forced to dig them, knowing many would die underground without ever seeing daylight again. This integration blurred the line between concentration camp and industrial site. German companies profited from prisoner labor while maintaining plausible deniability. Executives rarely witnessed the conditions firsthand. Contracts were signed, quotas enforced, and deaths accepted as part of the process. Mauthausen demonstrated how genocide could be distributed across institutions, allowing responsibility to dissolve into bureaucracy. The SS used the camp as both punishment and deterrence. Prisoners from other camps were transferred to Mauthausen specifically to break them. The camp's reputation traveled faster than its trains. To be sent there was to be marked as disposable, a message intended not just for prisoners but for entire resistance movements. Mauthausen also served as a testing ground for methods later expanded elsewhere. Techniques of forced labor, starvation rations, disciplinary systems, and execution protocols were refined and standardized. SS personnel carried their experience to other camps, spreading cruelty as a transferable skill set. As extermination camps reached peak operation during Operation Reinhard, Mauthausen remained essential. It absorbed those deemed unfit for immediate killing or those whose labor could still be extracted before death. This division of labor between camps reveals the horrifying efficiency of the Holocaust. Different places killing in different ways, all toward the same goal. The camp's medical abuse further connected it to the broader genocidal project. Doctors conducted experiments without consent, testing endurance, infection, and recovery limits. Prisoners were reduced to data points. These practices mirrored similar crimes in other camps, reinforcing the idea that human bodies existed to be studied, used, and discarded. As Allied forces advanced and extermination camps were dismantled, Mauthausen became even more lethal. Evacuation transports poured in from across collapsing fronts. Starvation worsened. Disease exploded. The camp shifted from calculated exploitation to chaotic extermination. Death rates surged as the SS attempted to squeeze the last utility from a collapsing system. This transition exposes a crucial truth. The Holocaust was not static. It adapted to circumstances. When efficiency failed, brutality escalated. When secrecy collapsed, evidence was destroyed. Mauthausen survived as long as it did because it remained useful until the very end. By placing Mauthausen within the Holocaust's full structure, its purpose becomes unmistakable. It was not an anomaly. It was a pillar, a place where ideology, economics, and terror converged into a functioning system of destruction that required participation from thousands who never fired a gun. Chapter 8 begins the final analytical phase of this documentary. Moving beyond chronology into meaning, Mauthausen shows us that genocide does not rely solely on hatred. It relies on organization, normalization, and the willingness to accept human loss as operational cost. In the next segment, we will examine the psychology of obedience that allowed such a system to function, and why understanding that obedience matters long after the camps have fallen silent. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Obedience, Routine, and the Psychology of a Killing System. By the time Mauthausen reached the final phase of its existence, the most terrifying aspect of the camp was no longer its violence alone, but how ordinary that violence had become. The daily operation of the camp depended not on constant rage or fanaticism, but on routine, hierarchy, and obedience, a system in which thousands of people carried out roles that contributed to mass death without ever needing to confront the full moral weight of what they were doing. Mauthausen reveals how genocide can function not only through hatred, but through compliance, normalization, and distance. The SS guards at Mauthausen were not all ideological fanatics. Many were young men trained to follow orders, rewarded for discipline, and punished for deviation. The camp operated on strict chains of command, where responsibility flowed upward and guilt was diffused downward. Guards did not see themselves as murderers. They were watchmen, clerks, supervisors, engineers, medics, drivers. Each task was small, limited, and framed as necessary. No single individual in their own mind carried responsibility for the whole. This fragmentation of responsibility was deliberate. Orders were rarely explicit commands to kill. Instead, they were framed as regulations, quotas, or procedures. Prisoners were assigned workloads that were physically impossible to survive. Rations were calculated to sustain life just long enough to extract labor. Punishments were codified in manuals. Death became the predictable outcome of following the rules correctly. Routine stripped violence of its emotional impact. Executions were scheduled. Roll calls lasted for hours in freezing weather and were treated as administrative necessity. Corpses were counted, recorded, and removed with bureaucratic precision. Over time, even extraordinary cruelty faded into background noise. What shocked new arrivals barely registered to those who had been there longer. This normalization extended beyond the SS. Civilian contractors entered subcamps, inspected work sites, and negotiated production demands. Railway officials coordinated transports. Factory managers requested more labor when output declined. Doctors filled out death certificates with false causes. Each participant saw only a narrow slice of the system, and within that slice, atrocity appeared routine. Mauthausen also relied heavily on prisoner functionaries, known as capos, who were forced into positions of authority over other prisoners. These roles were designed to fracture solidarity and transfer daily violence onto the victims themselves. Capos enforced discipline, assigned work details, and punished resistance, often brutally because their own survival depended on it. The SS understood that forcing victims to police one another deepened trauma and reduced direct SS involvement. Obedience was reinforced through terror, but also through incentives. Guards who demonstrated efficiency were promoted. Prisoners who complied were given marginally better food or shelter. Small privileges created competition and eroded collective resistance. Survival became individualized, making moral choices feel impossible. Language played a crucial role. Words like transport, evacuation, special treatment, and labor deployment concealed reality. Bureaucratic language created psychological distance, allowing participants to operate without confronting the human consequences. Killing was never described as killing. Death became an outcome, not an act. Training at Mauthausen emphasized discipline over reflection. SS personnel were conditioned to view prisoners as enemies, criminals, or subhumans, but more importantly, as objects within a system. This framing reduced empathy and encouraged emotional detachment. Guards learned not to ask why, only how. Fear of punishment reinforced obedience. The Nazi state punished disobedience harshly, and the camp environment amplified that fear. Refusal to follow orders could mean transfer to the front, imprisonment, or death. Moral resistance required extraordinary courage, and most people under such pressure complied. As the war turned against Germany, this obedience did not weaken. In fact, it intensified. Chaos made cruelty worse. Orders became harsher. Death rates soared. The system no longer pretended to function humanely. It simply consumed what remained. Yet even then, paperwork continued. Reports were filed. Procedures were followed. The machinery kept moving until it physically collapsed. Mauthausen exposes a disturbing truth about human behavior. Extreme evil does not require constant cruelty from every participant. It requires systems that reward compliance, punish dissent, and fragment responsibility so completely that no one feels accountable for the outcome. This is why the camp matters beyond its physical history. Mauthausen demonstrates that genocide is not only an ideological project, but an organizational one. It thrives where obedience replaces conscience, where routine replaces reflection, and where individuals surrender moral judgment to authority. In the next segment, we will examine the moments when this system fractured, when resistance emerged inside the camp, when prisoners reclaimed agency under impossible conditions, and when obedience, for some, finally broke. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Resistance, Sabotage, and the Struggle to Remain Human. Even inside a system engineered to erase identity, obedience was never absolute. At Mauthausen-gusen, resistance did not often look like open revolt. It appeared instead in fragile, dangerous, and deeply human acts, moments where prisoners chose solidarity over survival, memory over erasure, and dignity over submission. These acts rarely changed the system, but they challenged its deepest goal, the total destruction of human will. From the earliest years of the camp, prisoners sought ways to resist, even when resistance meant near certain death. Political prisoners, particularly communists, social democrats, and resistance fighters from across Europe, formed the backbone of organized defiance. Many had experience operating underground networks before their arrest. In Mauthausen, they adapted those skills to an environment of constant surveillance, starvation, and terror. Resistance often began with information. Prisoners secretly shared news from outside the camp, whispers about Allied advances, rumors of German defeats, fragments of radio broadcasts overheard by civilian workers. Even unverified information mattered. It broke the illusion of Nazi invincibility and gave prisoners something the camp sought to destroy: hope. Sabotage became another form of resistance. In quarries, workshops, and armaments factories, prisoners deliberately slowed production, damaged tools, misaligned parts, or weakened materials. These acts were subtle and extremely dangerous. Discovery meant torture or execution. But sabotage allowed prisoners to reclaim a measure of agency, turning forced labor into quiet defiance. Medical prisoners resisted by falsifying records, hiding the sick, or exchanging diagnoses to spare others from execution or experimentation. Doctors and nurses imprisoned for political reasons used their limited authority to save lives where possible, diluting injections, falsifying death certificates, or assigning less lethal work details. Every saved life was an act of rebellion. One of the most powerful forms of resistance was mutual aid. Prisoners shared food, clothing, and information even when doing so reduced their own chances of survival. In a system designed to pit victims against one another, solidarity itself became dangerous. Yet clandestine support networks persisted, built on trust forged under unimaginable pressure. Children and adolescents imprisoned at Mauthausen and its subcamps resisted simply by surviving. Older prisoners shielded them, taught them how to avoid the most lethal work details, and smuggled food to them whenever possible. Preserving the lives of the young became a moral imperative for many inmates, a refusal to allow the camp to extinguish the future entirely. Cultural resistance also endured. Prisoners composed poems, songs, and prayers in secret. Some kept mental diaries, memorizing events with the intention of bearing witness if they survived. Others taught languages, mathematics, or history in whispered lessons at night. These acts asserted that prisoners were still thinking, learning human beings, not numbers. There were also moments of overt defiance. In some subcamps, prisoners attacked guards, destroyed records, or attempted escapes despite overwhelming odds. Most escape attempts failed, and reprisals were brutal. Entire barracks were punished for the actions of a few. Yet the willingness to attempt escape demonstrated that the camp never fully succeeded in crushing resistance. As the war neared its end, resistance networks grew more coordinated. Prisoners understood that chaos would accompany Germany's collapse. They prepared to protect evidence, preserve documents, and prevent mass executions during evacuation. In some areas, resistance groups sabotaged evacuation plans, hid prisoners, or seized weapons in the final days. The greatest act of resistance was survival itself. Every day a prisoner endured starvation, exhaustion, and terror was a denial of the system's purpose. Survival was not passive. It required constant adaptation, cooperation, and moral choices under conditions designed to strip all three away. Resistance at Mauthausen was never romantic. It was fragmented, desperate, and often invisible. Many who resisted did not live to see liberation, but their actions mattered. They preserved truth where lies dominated. They upheld humanity where dehumanization ruled. The Nazis intended Mauthausen to produce only silence. Instead, it produced witnesses. In the next chapter, we will turn to the final phase of the camp, evacuation, collapse, and liberation, and examine how the system of death unraveled, how survivors were found at the edge of life, and how the world first confronted what Mauthausen had been designed to hide. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Evacuation orders and the beginning of the death marches. By the winter of 1944, the end of Nazi Germany was no longer a distant possibility. It was an approaching certainty. The Allied armies were advancing from the west, and the Red Army was pushing relentlessly from the east. The Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own crimes. Yet inside Mauthausen-gusen, the machinery of suffering did not slow. Instead, it entered its most chaotic and lethal phase. As front lines drew closer, the SS leadership faced a problem of their own making. The camps were filled with tens of thousands of prisoners, living evidence of mass murder, forced labor, and systematic extermination. Liberation would expose the truth. Orders began to circulate through the camp system. Prisoners were to be evacuated, transferred, or eliminated before Allied forces could reach them. Evacuation did not mean rescue or relocation to safety. It meant death marches. Beginning in early 1945, transports arrived at Mauthausen from camps further east, Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and others already being overrun by Soviet forces. These prisoners arrived after weeks of marching through winter snow, beaten, starved, and shot if they fell behind. Many died on the roads. Those who survived reached Mauthausen only to find a camp already beyond collapse. The population of the Mauthausen complex surged far beyond capacity. Barracks meant for a few hundred now held thousands. Prisoners slept standing, sitting, or collapsed atop one another. Food rations dwindled to near nothing. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread uncontrollably. Death became constant and visible. Bodies lay in courtyards, stairwells, and barracks, waiting to be removed. Instead of improving conditions, the SS accelerated evacuations. Prisoners deemed weak, sick, or expendable were selected for transport. They were told they were being moved to safer camps. In reality, many were being sent on marches designed to kill them. Death marches left Mauthausen and its subcamps in all directions. Prisoners were forced to walk for days or weeks through freezing temperatures with no food, no shelter, and little water. Guards shot anyone who stumbled, lagged behind, or collapsed. Civilians along the routes were forbidden to help. Some tried anyway, passing bread or water in secret, acts that could mean death if discovered. The purpose of these marches was not efficiency. It was erasure. The SS intended to eliminate witnesses through exhaustion and execution. Where marching was impossible, prisoners were crammed into open rail cars, exposed to cold, rain, and starvation. Many arrived already dead. Others never arrived at all. Inside Mauthausen, conditions worsened daily. Crematoria could no longer keep up with the number of dead. Bodies were burned in open pits or left to decay. Guards grew more brutal, driven by fear, desperation, and ideological hatred. Discipline collapsed into cruelty. Yet even as the system unraveled, orders to continue killing persisted. Prisoners were still beaten for minor infractions. Executions continued. Forced labor went on until there was no strength left to extract. Some SS officers began to flee, abandoning posts and discarding uniforms. Others remained fanatically committed to the end, determined to carry out their duties regardless of the war's outcome. This split created unpredictable danger for prisoners. Moments of sudden violence followed by stretches of eerie neglect. Resistance networks inside the camp understood that the final danger was approaching. Evacuation could mean death on the road or mass execution inside the camp. Prisoners began hiding the weakest among them, falsifying work assignments, and sabotaging evacuation lists. Survival now depended on avoiding movement. For many, there was no choice. They were forced onto the roads anyway. Skeletons marching through snow, watched by guards who still believed obedience mattered more than humanity. Thousands died in these final weeks, killed not by gas chambers or bullets alone, but by exposure, starvation, and deliberate abandonment. The death marches marked the last phase of Mauthausen's purpose. The camp no longer existed to exploit labor. It existed to eliminate witnesses before the truth could be revealed. But the system was collapsing faster than the SS could control it. In the next segment, we will follow the final days inside the camp itself. As evacuation orders failed, SS authority disintegrated, and liberation approached a place that had been built to ensure no one ever left alive. Chapter 9, Segment 2. Total collapse inside the camp. As evacuation orders drained prisoners from Mauthausen-gusen, the camp did not empty, it imploded. By early 1945, the SS no longer controlled a functioning concentration camp. What remained was a collapsing landscape of starvation, disease, corpses, and fear, held together only by habit, terror, and the fading authority of guards who knew the end was near. Inside the main camp, order dissolved first in small ways. Roll calls became irregular. Work details were announced and then abandoned. Guards argued openly with one another. Some drank heavily. Others disappeared for days at a time. The carefully regulated brutality that had defined Mauthausen for years gave way to unpredictable violence. Sudden beatings, arbitrary executions, and moments of eerie silence where no orders came at all. The prisoner population left behind was the weakest of all. Those unable to march, the sick, the emaciated, the dying, were packed into barracks with no medical care, no sanitation, and almost no food. Barracks floors were slick with waste. Lice covered bodies. Typhus spread without resistance, carried from one skeletal frame to another. Fevered prisoners lay delirious, whispering names, reliving memories, or simply staring at nothing. Food distributions, already minimal, collapsed almost entirely. Watery soup arrived irregularly, sometimes not at all. Bread rations were cut again and again until they vanished. Prisoners scavenged for anything remotely edible: grass, bark, potato peels, scraps from garbage pits. Hunger became constant pain, gnawing and dizzying, blurring thought and time. Death ceased to be an event. It became background. Bodies were everywhere. In barracks, prisoners slept beside corpses because there was nowhere to move them. In courtyards, piles of dead lay uncovered for days. The crematoria no longer functioned properly. There was no fuel, no manpower, and too many bodies. Open-air burnings began, filling the camp with thick smoke and a smell that survivors later said never left them. SS guards responded not with mercy, but with withdrawal and cruelty in equal measure. Some guards avoided contact entirely, locking themselves in offices or fleeing the camp perimeter. Others lashed out violently, venting fear and rage on prisoners who could no longer resist. Executions still occurred: hangings, shootings, beatings, carried out with little record and no pretense of discipline. Command structures disintegrated. Orders from Berlin arrived late or not at all. The Reich no longer had the resources to maintain control, yet the ideology that justified cruelty remained intact. Even as defeat loomed, prisoners were still seen not as human beings, but as enemies to be erased or ignored. Within this collapse, prisoner resistance took on a different form. There were no uprisings, no weapons, no dramatic confrontations. Resistance meant survival. Prisoners hid the sick during selections. They shared crumbs of food. They moved bodies to make space for the living. They memorized names, faces, and details, determined that if anyone survived, the truth would be carried out. Some political prisoners, especially those imprisoned for years, quietly took control of internal camp functions as SS oversight weakened. They organized makeshift sanitation, distributed food as fairly as possible, and kept order inside barracks to prevent total chaos. These actions saved lives, not many, but some, in a place designed to ensure none survived. Outside the camp, the sound of artillery grew louder. Rumors spread: the Americans were close, the war was ending, liberation was coming. Hope returned cautiously, dangerously. Many prisoners had seen hope before, only to be crushed. Others clung to it because it was all they had left. The SS debated what to do with those who remained. Some discussed mass execution. Others argued there was no time, no ammunition, no coordination left. The camp existed in limbo, a killing ground without clear orders, suspended between annihilation and exposure. As April approached, fear shifted from prisoners to guards. The realization set in that witnesses were still alive. Evidence still stood, and the world was about to see what Mauthausen had been. The system that had promised total control through terror had reached its final failure. Could no longer kill efficiently. Could no longer hide. Could only decay. In the next segment, we will witness the final days before liberation, the arrival of Allied forces, the SS' last actions, and the moment when a camp built for death was forced to face the outside world for the first time. Chapter 9, Segment 3. The Days Before Liberation. In the final days of April 1945, Mauthausen-gusen existed in a state that survivors later struggled to describe as either life or death. The camp was no longer functioning as a controlled instrument of the SS, yet it had not become free. It hovered in a terrifying in-between. A place abandoned by authority but still ruled by hunger, disease, and the momentum of cruelty that had been built into its foundations. By this point, tens of thousands of prisoners had already been driven out on evacuation marches. Those who remained were the weakest, the sickest, the ones whose bodies had been exhausted beyond use. The SS had not spared them out of mercy. They had left them because they were inconvenient, unable to march, unable to work, unable to be managed. Inside the camp, rumors multiplied faster than facts. Prisoners whispered that American tanks were only days away. Others claimed the SS planned to massacre everyone before retreating. Some believed the camp would be bombed. Some believed nothing would happen at all. Every rumor carried hope and terror in equal measure. The guards themselves were changing. Their uniforms were dirtier, their posture less rigid. Discipline slipped. Orders contradicted one another. Some guards abandoned posts entirely, slipping away at night, removing insignia, or disguising themselves as civilians. Others stayed armed, nervous, unpredictable, clinging to authority even as it evaporated. Executions did not stop completely. In the days before liberation, several prisoners were still shot or beaten to death for minor infractions or no reason at all. Violence had become erratic, driven less by policy than by panic. Guards acted on impulse, fear, and years of indoctrination that told them prisoners were not human. Food distributions all but vanished. Prisoners survived on memory, on instinct, on scraps hidden days earlier. Many were too weak to stand. Others crawled. Some lay motionless for hours, conserving energy, unsure whether sleep would end in waking or death. Disease raged unchecked. Typhus continued to spread through lice-infested clothing and bodies packed together for warmth. Dysentery weakened those who had already been starved for months or years. Medical care was non-existent. Prisoner doctors and orderlies did what they could with nothing. Torn cloth, dirty water whispered reassurance. Death surrounded everything. Prisoners stepped over bodies on the way to roll call. Corpses lay in bunks, courtyards, stairwells. There was no ceremony, no separation between the living and the dead. Survival itself felt accidental, arbitrary, determined by chance as much as strength. Yet even here, even now, humanity persisted. Prisoners spoke quietly to one another about families, homes, futures they might never reach. They promised to remember names. They memorized faces. They shared stories not to escape reality, but to anchor themselves in it. In a camp designed to erase identity, memory became resistance. Some prisoners, particularly long-term political detainees, prepared for what might come after liberation. They discussed how to maintain order if the guards fled. They planned to protect the sick from chaos. They understood that freedom would not arrive cleanly. It would arrive into a disaster zone. Outside the camp, the sound of artillery grew unmistakable. Planes crossed the sky. The war was no longer distant. It pressed against the barbed wire, against the watchtowers, against the ideology that had sustained the camp for 8 years. On May 4, 1945, SS authority effectively collapsed. Guards abandoned towers. Gates were left unguarded. Prisoners hesitated. Many had seen traps before. Some feared that stepping outside would bring gunfire. Others feared staying inside would mean death if the SS returned. When the first American armored units approached Mauthausen on May 5, they did not find an organized surrender. They found a camp already in ruins, physically, morally, structurally. What they encountered defied preparation. Soldiers were hit first by silence, then by smell, decay, smoke, waste. Then they saw the prisoners, men and boys reduced to bone and skin. Eyes sunken, movements slow, expressions caught between disbelief and terror. Some prisoners wept. Others stood motionless. Many did not understand that liberation had arrived. American troops documented everything they saw. They photographed bodies, barracks, crematoria, warehouses filled with belongings taken from the dead. They brought in medical teams, but the scale of suffering overwhelmed immediate response. Liberation did not mean instant rescue. Many prisoners would die in the days and weeks after, their bodies too damaged to recover. The SS guards who remained were arrested. Some were forced to confront the camp, to see what had been done under their authority. Others vanished into the chaos of defeat, blending into a collapsing Germany. For survivors, liberation was not an ending. It was a threshold. Many could not walk. Many could not eat without danger. Many carried diseases, trauma, and grief that would never leave them. Freedom arrived quietly, painfully, unevenly. Mauthausen-gusen had been designed as a place where people entered and did not return. In its final days, that design failed, not because the system softened, but because it collapsed under its own brutality. The camp did not end with explosions or last stands. It ended with exposure, with witnesses, with the truth stepping into daylight. In the next chapter, we will confront what followed, the immediate aftermath, the struggle to keep survivors alive, the gathering of evidence, and the long process of reckoning that would define how the world understood what Mauthausen had been and what it revealed about humanity itself. Chapter 10, Segment 1. Liberation was not the end. When the gates of Mauthausen finally stood open in early May 1945, the world would later describe it as liberation. But for the survivors inside the camp, liberation did not feel like an ending. It felt like the sudden removal of terror without the return of life. What remained was devastation so complete that freedom itself became another trial to survive. American forces entered a place that no longer resembled a functioning camp, yet still bore the full weight of what it had been designed to do. The SS had fled or surrendered in fragments. Administrative order had collapsed. What remained was a vast landscape of starvation, disease, corpses, and human beings whose bodies and minds had been pushed beyond natural limits. Soldiers documented what they found with urgency. Barracks filled with skeletal men lying motionless on wooden planks. Courtyards scattered with unburied bodies. Crematoria that could no longer hide their purpose. Storehouses filled with shoes, clothing, eyeglasses, and personal items taken from the dead, material proof of systematic murder. The scale was overwhelming even for troops hardened by months of combat. For many prisoners, liberation did not immediately register as safety. Years of conditioning had taught them that sudden changes often meant punishment or death. Some hid. Some refused food, fearing poison. Others were too weak to respond at all. Their bodies had adapted to starvation in ways that made normal nourishment deadly. Eating too much, too quickly could kill them, a condition doctors would later call refeeding syndrome, though few understood it at the time. Medical teams rushed in, but the damage was already profound. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and severe malnutrition spread through bodies that had no reserves left. Survivors were separated, cleaned, deloused, and fed slowly, carefully. Even so, thousands would die after liberation, victims not of bullets or beatings, but of what prolonged deprivation had done to their organs. Children were found among the survivors, some orphaned, some having survived through luck or the protection of other prisoners. Many could barely speak. Others had forgotten their own names. Their survival was a cruel paradox. Living proof of endurance and evidence of how deeply trauma could erase childhood itself. American authorities immediately began collecting testimony. Survivors spoke when they could, haltingly, emotionally, sometimes collapsing mid-sentence. They described the quarry, the stairs, the beatings, the hunger, the selections, the endless roll calls. Many had assumed no one would ever hear their stories. Now they were being asked to remember everything. The camp itself became evidence. Every structure, every document, every corpse was part of a crime scene unlike anything the modern world had encountered. Mauthausen was no accident of war. It was an engineered system of destruction, designed, staffed, and maintained by a state that claimed legality, order, and purpose. Nearby German civilians were brought to see the camp. Some claimed ignorance. Others were silent. The proximity of the camp to towns and roads made denial increasingly difficult. The smell alone, survivors later said, should have been impossible to ignore. For survivors, the question of what came next was terrifying. Many had no homes to return to. Entire families had been murdered. Countries had been destroyed, borders erased, identities criminalized. Liberation meant standing at the edge of an unknown world with nothing but memory and a damaged body. Some survivors remained in the camp for weeks or months after liberation, simply because there was nowhere else to go. Others were transferred to displaced persons camps. Some began searching for relatives, clinging to lists, rumors, Red Cross notices. Most searches ended in silence. Justice, at first, felt abstract. Survivors wanted food, rest, safety, not trials. But the world was already moving toward reckoning. Investigators gathered records. SS personnel were identified. Witnesses were prepared. Mauthausen would not disappear quietly into the rubble of defeat. Yet for many who survived, justice would never feel complete. No sentence could restore lost years. No execution could balance the scale of suffering. What mattered most was that the truth would not be buried with the dead. Liberation did not erase Mauthausen, transformed it. The camp became a warning, a physical reminder of how bureaucracy, ideology, and obedience can be fused into machinery that destroys human beings methodically, legally, and efficiently. It showed that genocide does not require chaos. It requires organization. In the next segment, we will follow what happened after liberation, the trials, the testimonies, the struggle over memory, and how Mauthausen-gusen entered history not only as a site of death, but as evidence of what happens when a society accepts dehumanization as policy and calls it order. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Trials, Testimony, and the Struggle for Justice. After the gates of Mauthausen-gusen were opened, the camp did not simply dissolve into history. It became evidence. Every surviving prisoner, every SS document, every scarred building and abandoned quarry was now part of a vast criminal record, one that demanded accountability in a world struggling to understand what it had just uncovered. In the weeks following liberation, Allied investigators moved quickly. The fear was not only that perpetrators might escape, but that memory itself could fade before the truth was fully recorded. Survivors were asked to speak while the camp still stood as it had been left, before structures were dismantled, before bodies were buried, before time softened the details. Testimony was painful and exhausting. Many survivors had not spoken freely for years. Some had learned that words could kill. Now they were asked to recall names, dates, routines, punishments, faces. Some testified calmly, as if reciting a technical process. Others broke down mid-sentence, overcome by memories they had buried just to survive. Silence itself became a form of testimony. Gaps where trauma refused to translate into language. SS personnel captured in the camp and nearby areas were interrogated. Some claimed they were only guards. Others insisted they followed orders. A few openly admitted brutality, convinced they would be protected by the chaos of post-war Europe. But the evidence was too extensive, too detailed, too systematic to dismiss as isolated cruelty. The Mauthausen trials began under American military jurisdiction later in 1945. They were among the earliest war crimes trials held on German soil. Unlike later international proceedings, these trials focused specifically on the crimes committed inside the Mauthausen camp system: murder, torture, starvation, medical abuse, and the systematic destruction of human life. Former camp commanders, guards, doctors, capos, and administrators stood accused. Survivors identified them from the witness stand, sometimes recognizing voices before faces, sometimes freezing as memories flooded back. For many, pointing at a former SS man was not an act of revenge, but an act of reclaiming reality. For years, power had belonged exclusively to the perpetrators. Now, truth belonged to the victims. Defendants often relied on the same defense: obedience. Orders came from above. Refusal meant punishment. Responsibility was diffused across the system. But prosecutors dismantled this argument piece by piece. Evidence showed initiative in cruelty, enthusiasm in punishment, creativity in humiliation. This was not mechanical compliance alone, it was participation. Sentences varied. Some received death penalties. Others were given long prison terms. Many survivors felt the punishments were insufficient. How could decades of suffering be weighed against a few years behind bars? Justice, they learned, was a legal process, not a moral balance. Outside the courtroom, another struggle unfolded: memory versus denial. As Germany rebuilt, pressure grew to look forward rather than backward. Camps like Mauthausen were seen by some as uncomfortable remnants of defeat. There were attempts to minimize, to relativize, to forget. Survivors resisted this erasure. They formed associations, published memoirs, returned to the campsite to speak to students, journalists, and officials. For them, remembrance was not symbolic. It was a responsibility owed to those who did not survive. Mauthausen itself changed form. The camp was partially dismantled. The quarry fell silent. Barracks collapsed or were removed. But the core of the site was preserved as a memorial. Stone replaced barbed wire. Silence replaced orders. Yet the weight of what happened remained embedded in the landscape. The camp's classification as a Category 3 extermination through labor site became a central point in Holocaust research. Historians emphasized that not all killing centers relied on gas chambers. Mauthausen demonstrated another path to annihilation, one built on exhaustion, starvation, and calculated brutality disguised as work. This distinction mattered. It showed that genocide adapts. It uses whatever tools a society already has: industry, law, discipline, hierarchy. Death does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it is delivered slowly, through quotas, schedules, and routine. For survivors, life after testimony was complex. Some rebuilt families. Others lived alone, carrying memories that never faded. Nightmares persisted. The sound of boots, whistles, or shouted orders could return them instantly to the camp. Freedom did not erase conditioning. Yet many chose to speak anyway. They understood something the world was only beginning to grasp: Silence had been one of the camp's most powerful weapons. Breaking it was an act of resistance even after survival. The trials did not close the story of Mauthausen. They opened a new chapter, one about responsibility beyond perpetrators. What about the engineers who designed the quarry system? The companies that profited from forced labor? The neighbors who watched transports arrive? The officials who signed documents but never held a weapon? These questions extended beyond Germany. They challenged every modern society that relies on bureaucracy, obedience, and moral distance. Mauthausen was not an anomaly. It was a warning embedded in modern systems themselves. In the next segment, we will explore how Mauthausen is remembered today, how memory was shaped, contested, and preserved, and why the phrase "death through labor" remains one of the most chilling lessons of the Holocaust, not only about the past, but about the structures that still govern the present. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Memory, Warning, and the Lesson of Death Through Labor. Mauthausen-gusen does not end with liberation, trials, or memorial stones. Its true legacy unfolds long after the barbed wire was cut, in how the camp is remembered, misunderstood, resisted, and, at times, deliberately ignored. Memory itself became a battlefield, one where truth had to be defended against forgetting, denial, and simplification. In the years following the war, Europe was exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, populations were displaced, and political tensions were already hardening into the Cold War. In this climate, remembrance was often treated as a burden. Survivors were encouraged to rebuild quietly. Nations preferred heroic narratives of resistance over uncomfortable stories of complicity. Camps like Mauthausen risked becoming footnotes rather than warnings. Yet Mauthausen resisted erasure. Its scale, its quarry, and its classification as a death-through-labor camp made it impossible to reduce to abstraction. Unlike extermination centers built solely for killing, Mauthausen revealed something more unsettling: how ordinary mechanisms of work, discipline, and productivity could be transformed into tools of annihilation without ever appearing chaotic or overtly violent. Here, death was organized. It followed schedules. It wore the disguise of labor assignments, performance quotas, and administrative language. Prisoners were not always killed immediately. They were consumed. This distinction matters deeply. It shows that genocide does not require constant spectacle. It can function quietly, efficiently, and bureaucratically. It can be embedded in systems that resemble normal life, workplaces, rules, chains of command. Mauthausen was not an exception to modernity. It was a product of it. As Holocaust scholarship expanded in the decades that followed, historians increasingly emphasized this point. Mauthausen and Gusen demonstrated that mass murder could be achieved without gas chambers alone. Exhaustion, malnutrition, exposure, beatings, and calculated neglect were sufficient. The quarry was not merely a labor site, it was a weapon. Survivors continued to return to the campsite. Some stood silently. Others spoke to students, soldiers, and visitors. They described how time felt inside the camp, how days blurred, how the future vanished, how survival became a narrow calculation of calories, strength, and luck. Many emphasized that the most dangerous moment was not arrival, but weakness. Once a prisoner slowed, the system removed them. Memorialization itself evolved. Early monuments focused on national suffering, plaques for specific countries, languages, or resistance groups. Over time, remembrance broadened to include Roma victims, homosexual prisoners, disabled people, Soviet POWs, and others long excluded from public narratives. Memory became more inclusive but also more complex. Mauthausen forced a difficult question. How do you commemorate a place where suffering was the point, not a byproduct? There was no single moment of catastrophe, no final gas chamber photograph that captured the whole truth. The horror unfolded slowly, repetitively, almost invisibly. This made denial easier and therefore more dangerous. Holocaust denial and distortion emerged in the post-war decades, often targeting camps like Mauthausen that lacked the immediate visual shorthand of extermination centers. Deniers exploited ignorance, cherry-picked statistics, and misrepresented forced labor as punishment rather than policy. Survivors responded with testimony, documents, and relentless insistence on detail. They understood that the battle was not only about what happened, but about how societies learn to recognize warning signs. Mauthausen teaches that atrocity does not begin with murder. It begins with classification, with language that reduces people to categories, with systems that reward obedience over conscience, with institutions that prioritize efficiency over humanity. The camp's SS training function amplified this lesson. Sachsenhausen may have been the administrative model, but Mauthausen was the laboratory of endurance, a place where guards learned how far a human body could be pushed before it collapsed, and how that collapse could be framed as failure rather than murder. This knowledge was exported. Other camps adopted similar labor regimes. Corporations learned how to extract value from human exhaustion. The boundary between punishment and profit dissolved. In this sense, Mauthausen stands as one of the clearest examples of how genocide integrates itself into everyday structures. It did not rely on fanaticism alone. It relied on paperwork, logistics, and normalized cruelty. For modern audiences, this is perhaps the most unsettling legacy. Mauthausen does not allow us to distance ourselves by calling its perpetrators monsters. Many were educated. Many were disciplined. Many believed they were doing their jobs well. The lesson is not that evil is alien. It is that evil can be methodical. Today, Mauthausen-gusen is preserved as a memorial and educational site. Visitors walk the Appellplatz. They descend into the quarry. They stand at the base of the stairs. The silence is intentional. It forces reflection rather than spectacle. Yet remembrance is never guaranteed. It must be renewed by each generation. Every time the camp is studied, taught, or spoken aloud, the system that once erased lives is denied its final victory. The phrase "death through labor" remains one of the most precise summaries of Nazi terror, not because it is dramatic, but because it is accurate. It captures the transformation of work into a killing process, and of human beings into expendable material. Mauthausen's victims did not die suddenly. They were consumed slowly by a system that called itself order. Remembering Mauthausen is not only about honoring the dead. It is about recognizing how easily modern societies can construct mechanisms that destroy without ever appearing openly murderous. That is why this history matters, not as a distant tragedy, but as a permanent warning. Because systems do not announce when they cross the line. They normalize it. Mauthausen-gusen. Death through laboras. The night settles. We leave Mauthausen not with closure, but with understanding. This camp did not exist to kill quickly. It existed to drain life slowly, through work, hunger, fear, and exhaustion, until death arrived as a formality. Mauthausen-gusen showed the world that genocide does not always wear the face of chaos. Sometimes it wears uniforms, schedules, and rules. Sometimes it calls itself order. The men, women, and children who passed through these gates were not statistics. They were teachers, workers, artists, farmers, students. They were reduced to numbers, then to labor, and finally to silence, but memory refuses that silence. What remains today is not just stone walls and staircases carved into rock. What remains is a warning, a reminder of how easily humanity can be stripped away when obedience replaces conscience, and when systems value productivity over life. As you rest, let this history stay where it belongs, remembered, acknowledged, and never repeated. If this documentary helped you understand, remember, or reflect, consider sharing it because memory is an act of resistance. Thank you for listening. Good night.